Thomas Fenn was a carpenter, not a surgeon. There wasn't one aboard. So when Captain John Phillips took a musket ball to the leg during a fight off the coast of Newfoundland, the job fell to the man who normally worked on planking. Fenn tucked the limb under his arm, according to the account, and separated it from the rest of Phillips in about the time it would have taken him to saw through a deal board. Then he heated a hatchet in the galley fire and pressed it to the wound to stop the bleeding, because a red-hot axe was the only cautery iron on the ship. Here's what it actually looked like, on the ships where nobody with any real medical training had ever set foot. Tonight, you're going to live through it. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Maybe turn on a fan for that low background hum. You have painkillers in a cabinet down the hall right now. Where we're going, the painkiller is rum, and there usually isn't much of that either. So get comfortable, let your shoulders go heavy, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake with a stomach that doesn't feel like your own. That's the first sign, and it's easy to ignore, because everything about your body has felt slightly wrong since the day you signed on. The hammock leaves a crease in your back. The biscuit tastes of nothing but salt and, if you're unlucky, of the small brown weevils that have taken up residence inside it. So a little nausea, a little heat behind the eyes, you tell yourself it's nothing. You've felt nothing before. You go up on deck anyway, because idle hands get noticed, and idle hands get you nothing when the plunder is divided. By midday, nothing has become something. Your joints ache in a way that has nothing to do with rope work. There's a taste in your mouth like old pennies. And when you finally admit to the man next to you that you're not right, he doesn't send for the doctor. There is no doctor. On most pirate vessels of the so-called Golden Age, roughly 1650 to the 1730s, a formally trained physician was a rare and valuable thing, closer to a captured prize than a crew position you could simply advertise for. What you get instead, on a ship like this one, is Josiah Teague. Teague is the cook. He's also, by informal and entirely unspoken agreement, the closest thing to a doctor this ship has got. It isn't as strange a pairing as it sounds. The cook is one of the only men aboard with a permanent fire, boiling water, and a set of knives he actually knows how to sharpen. He comes to look at you between meals, presses 2 fingers to your forehead, and delivers his diagnosis with the confidence of a man who has never once been proven right by a licensed physician, because no licensed physician has ever set foot on this deck to check his work. Fever, he says. Rest, and we'll see. It is, more or less, the extent of the available medicine. That's not a joke at Teague's expense. Not really. It's just the arithmetic of the trade. A merchant fleet in this period might carry 1 trained surgeon for every several hundred sailors, and pirate crews, who couldn't exactly post a job listing in a London newspaper, did even worse. So the job of doctor quietly falls to whoever on board has the steadiest hands and the least squeamish stomach. The cook, the carpenter, sometimes the quartermaster himself. You are, in short, about to be treated by a man whose actual qualification is that he once set his own broken finger and didn't cry about it. Welcome to Shipboard Medicine, Golden Age Edition. The smell reaches you before anything else does. Tar, bilge water, and under it, faint but unmistakable, the sour reek of a body that hasn't been properly washed in 3 weeks. That's just the smell of the lower deck on any given day, and today you're down here longer than usual, because Teague has decided you need to lie still. Lying still, it turns out, is its own kind of punishment. The lower deck of a sloop or brigantine gave a grown man perhaps 4.5 feet of headroom, and considerably less air. Ventilation below decks was so poor that ship's logs from the period routinely describe candles refusing to stay lit for lack of oxygen, and men returning from below gasping as though they'd been swimming. You lie in a hammock that sways with the roll of the ship, surrounded by the low murmur of 40-odd men who have absolutely nowhere else to be. And you begin to understand why sailors of the age feared the sick berth nearly as much as they feared the fight that put them there. Bad air was widely blamed for spreading illness, the theory of miasma, bad vapours rising from swamps and stagnant water, dominated medical thinking for another century yet, and below decks on a crowded ship, that theory had no shortage of evidence to point to. Teague brings you water in a wooden cup, and a spoonful of something dark and bitter he calls a physic, which is a catch-all term for basically any medicinal drink, whether it does anything or not. You ask him what's in it. He shrugs. Onions mostly and a little vinegar, and something he won't name because he suspects, correctly, that you wouldn't drink it if you knew. The pirate version of "Trust me, I'm a professional" is considerably less reassuring when the professional in question spent yesterday morning gutting fish. And yet, for all the gallows humour available here, it's worth sitting with what Teague is actually doing, staying by you, checking on you between his cooking duties, using what limited knowledge he has, because nobody else will. Pirate crews were not communities in the way a village was. They were transient, often coerced, held together as much by written articles and a shared cut of the plunder as by any bond of affection. But that doesn't mean no one cared whether you lived. It just means the caring took a different shape. It looked like a busy man finding 10 extra minutes. By your third day below decks, word has started moving around the ship the way it always does. Not from any official notice, because there isn't one, but ship to ship, mouth to mouth. A sailor named Griggs, who bunks 2 hammocks down, comes and tells you what he heard from a man on watch. 2 more hands have come down sick since yesterday, and one of them is worse than you. This is how information travels below decks on a wooden ship, with no ship's newspaper and no all-hands announcement system, second-hand, from whoever happened to be standing nearby when something was said. Griggs delivers this news the way he'd deliver a shipping report, flatly, because on a ship where death is a workplace hazard rather than an event, this barely counts as alarming. What you don't know yet, because nobody on this ship has the training to know it, is that fever is doing an enormous amount of work as a diagnosis. It could be typhus, spread by the lice that infested nearly every hammock and article of clothing aboard a wooden ship. It could be malaria or yellow fever if you've recently taken on water near a tropical port, carried not by bad air at all but by mosquitoes nobody yet understood as the actual culprit. That link wasn't established until the very end of the 19th century. It could be dysentery, grimly nicknamed the bloody flux, from drinking water that had gone foul in its cask, to Josiah Teague standing over you with his spoon of onion physic. All of these look roughly the same. A man who is hot, weak, and getting worse. The treatment, regardless of which of the above is actually killing you, is more or less identical. Rest, fluids, and hope. Here's the thing about hope on a pirate ship, though. It isn't purely sentimental. It's backed, in a strange and very practical way, by paperwork. Before you ever set foot on this vessel, you signed a set of written articles, the ship's own constitution, agreed upon by vote before the anchor was raised, and buried in among the rules about lights out and no gambling and no women aboard disguised as men, there is usually a clause about what happens if the ship's misfortune turns out to be yours specifically. We'll get to exactly what that clause promises later. For now, it's enough to know it exists, and that somewhere in your fevered brain you're aware of it too. 3 weeks out of port, and you are, against the odds, still breathing. Whatever it was, and you will genuinely never find out because nobody aboard has the equipment to tell you, has broken. Your fever cracked 2 nights ago in a slick, unpleasant sweat that soaked clean through the hammock canvas, and Teague, checking on you with his customary 2 fingers to the forehead, pronounced you on the mend with the same flat authority he'd used to pronounce you sick in the first place. You have no way of verifying his methods. You also, strangely, have no real complaint about the outcome. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it cuts against the story you might expect, that a ship with no doctor was simply a ship where the sick died. Plenty did. But plenty also didn't. For the same boring reason people have always survived illness throughout most of human history. A strong constitution, a mild strain of whatever it was, sheer chance, and a body given enough rest to fight on its own terms. Josiah Teague's onion physic almost certainly did nothing measurable for your recovery. What he did do, reliably, was keep you fed, keep you from being thrown back to deck duty too early and keep an eye on you when nobody else had the time. On a ship this size, that counted for more than it probably should have. Picture this. The same crew that would maroon a man for stealing so much as a piece of 8 from the common stock kept its cook checking on the sick between courses, unpaid extra, because that was simply what got done. Pirates get remembered for cruelty, and plenty of it was real. They get remembered far less often for this, for the unglamorous, everyday decency of men with almost nothing, doing the small thing anyway. 6 weeks out, and the ship takes its first prize since you fell ill, a merchant sloop out of Bristol, boarded without much of a fight, its captain wisely deciding that 30 pounds of cargo wasn't worth 30 pirates' worth of pistols. You're back on deck for this one, still a little thinner than you were, and you watch as the boarding party comes back with the usual haul, rum, cloth, a chest of coin, and, this is the detail that actually matters to you, a proper medicine chest, taken whole from the merchant captain's cabin. This was common practice, and not incidental. Pirate crews actively hunted for medicine chests the way they hunted for coin, because a stocked chest of genuine remedies, however limited 18th century medicine actually was, represented real, tangible value on a ship where the alternative was a cook's onion broth. Some pirate captains are recorded going out of their way to demand medicine chests specifically as ransom, holding a port or a captured crew hostage not for gold but for supplies. Teague pores over the new chest like a man handed a small fortune, which, functionally, he has been. Bottles of Peruvian bark, what we'd now recognise as an early source of quinine, genuinely useful against certain fevers, though nobody aboard understands the mechanism, sit next to jars whose labels have worn away entirely, and whose contents Teague eyes with open suspicion. And there, tucked at the bottom of the chest, wrapped in oilcloth, a small folding case of surgical instruments. Scalpels, a bone saw, a probe for digging out shot. Teague holds the saw up to the light, turns it over once, and sets it down again very carefully, as though it might go off. He knows exactly what it's for. He also knows with total clarity that he is not the man qualified to use it, and for now, on this particular voyage, that gap between having the tool and having the training is the entire story of medicine at sea. 2 months out, and the ship makes for a careening beach, a stretch of shallow, sheltered water where the crew can run the vessel aground at high tide, wait for the water to drop, and scrape the accumulated weed and barnacles from the hull before they slow the ship down enough to get everyone caught and hanged. It's filthy, exhausting work, and it's also, unexpectedly, where your convalescence properly ends. Days ashore. Actual ground under your feet instead of a swaying deck. Fresh water from a stream instead of a cask that's been breeding whatever lives in stagnant casks for 2 months. It's here that Teague, of all people, gets his moment of vindication. A local trader, the crew keeps up loose, unofficial contact with island traders throughout the Caribbean and along the American coast, men willing to sell provisions to pirates without asking too many questions about where the coin came from, arrives with fresh fruit, and among it a crate of limes. Nobody aboard yet understands why citrus matters. The actual cause of scurvy, a lack of vitamin C, wouldn't be nailed down by controlled experiment until James Linn's famous trial aboard Miss Salisbury in 1747, decades after this voyage. But sailors had noticed the pattern for generations regardless, even without the science behind it, and Teague, practical man that he is, has heard the folk wisdom second-hand from other cooks in other ports. He has the crew eat the limes anyway, for the blood, he says, which isn't remotely the correct explanation, and isn't remotely wrong to insist upon either. You eat your share, sour and strange, and feel maybe it's your imagination. Maybe it's genuinely the first fresh food in your body in 2 months. A little more like yourself. Here's the thing about pirate medicine that the record keeps proving. Quietly, again and again, it worked more often by accident and folk memory than by any real understanding of cause and effect. That doesn't make the outcome any less real for the man eating the lime. By the time the ship puts back to sea, 4 months into the voyage, you've become something like Teague's unofficial assistant. Not by any vote or article, just by the accident of having spent 6 weeks under his care and having nothing better to do with your convalescence than watch him work. You learn to change a dressing. You learn which of the jars in the new medicine chest are worth anything and which are almost certainly seawater and hope. You learn mostly how much of shipboard medicine in this era was really just careful nursing dressed up as expertise, clean bandages, changed often, food when it could be spared, rest enforced by whatever authority the doctor happened to carry. It's not nothing. Cleanliness, rest and basic nursing care, it turns out, actually do measurably improve survival odds from most of the illnesses a pirate crew was likely to encounter, a fact medicine wouldn't formally articulate for another century and a half, but one that Josiah Teague, cook and accidental physician, had arrived at through nothing more sophisticated than paying attention. When a topmast man named Fitch comes down with a deep, ugly rope burn gone septic across his palm, it's Teague who insists on washing it daily with vinegar water and changing the wrap, rather than the older shipboard habit of simply wrapping a wound once and leaving it. Fitch keeps the hand. It's a small, undocumented, entirely uncelebrated victory, the kind that never makes it into any pirate's trial deposition or any captain's log. And it happens anyway, dozens of times, on dozens of ships, credited to no one. What happens below decks when a real crisis hits, a shipboard epidemic, or a battle wound too severe for onion physic and clean bandages, is a different matter, and we'll get to it. But for now, on this ship, on this voyage, the system, such as it is, has held. 8 months out, nearing the end of this particular cruise, the ship takes a merchant vessel out of Liverpool, and this time, among the frightened crew mustered on deck for inspection, there's a surgeon. A real one, formally trained, with a proper medical education and a chest of instruments to match. His name, for the purposes of this story, doesn't survive the record. Dozens of captured ship surgeons from this era are mentioned only in passing, described but not named, footnotes to whichever pirate captain happened to take their ship. What we do know, from the pattern repeated across trial records and captains' accounts alike, is roughly how this moment goes. The pirate captain approaches him directly. Would he care to sign the articles? It's phrased as a question, and technically it is one. Surgeons, unlike ordinary sailors, were traditionally excused from the ordinary pressure to join, precisely because their skills were valuable enough that captains preferred a willing hand over a resentful one. But technically a question and safe to refuse were not always the same thing, and the surgeon knows it. He also knows, watching the crew around him, watching you, specifically, still a little too thin, still carrying the fading memory of 6 fevered weeks, with nothing but a cook's best guess between you and the void, exactly what waits for the next man like you if he says no. He signs, not eagerly, the record generally suggests, but not always as reluctantly as later testimony like to claim either, a detail we'll spend an entire chapter on shortly. Because what happens to men in his exact position when their ship is finally caught turns out to be one of the strangest and most consequential legal dramas of the entire Golden Age of Piracy. For now, though, all you know is this. For the first time since you signed your own articles, there is a man aboard who actually knows what he's doing. Teague, to his enormous credit, looks almost relieved. 9 months out, and you learn something else about shipboard sickness that nobody warned you about beforehand. Sometimes it isn't real, and everybody quietly agrees not to say so. The hand named Purefoy takes to his hammock 3 days before the ship is due to attempt a difficult passage past a stretch of reef every man aboard is dreading. His symptoms are vague, general weakness, an upset stomach, nothing Teague can pin down or disprove. Nobody accuses him outright. But there's a particular kind of silence that falls over a crew when a man's illness happens to arrive exactly when the dangerous work does, and you notice Teague's eyebrow rise just slightly higher than usual as he takes Purefoy's temperature with the back of his hand. Malingering, faking or exaggerating sickness to dodge duty, was a genuine and recognised problem on ships of every kind in this period. naval and merchant and piratical alike, precisely because sickness was such a fuzzy, unverifiable category when the only diagnostic tool available was a cook's palm against your forehead. A man complaining of a bad back or a mysterious fever was, in the era before thermometers were in common maritime use, essentially unfalsifiable. Pirate crews, as it happens, had their own blunt solution to this, baked directly into how the ship's articles handled compensation. Pay was tied to genuine, verifiable injury, a missing limb, a documented wound taken in a fight everyone had witnessed, rather than to vague self-reported illness, which kept the incentives at least somewhat honest. Purefoy gets no sympathy and no payout, just a cold look from the quartermaster and a return to duty the moment the reef is safely behind you, his stomach trouble resolving itself with suspicious speed. Nobody makes a formal case out of it. On a ship this small, everybody already knows, and the social cost of being known as the man who faked his way out of the reef passage will follow Purefoy considerably longer than any formal punishment would have. Congratulations, you've just watched 18th century peer pressure do the work of a personnel review. It's a strange, almost comforting footnote to the whole subject of sickness at sea. For every case of real, dangerous, potentially fatal illness this ship has seen you through, there's also this, the small, petty, deeply human business of a tired man trying to get out of dangerous work, and mostly failing because 30 other tired men are watching and none of them are fooled. By the ship's return to port, 10 months after you first felt that wrong turn in your stomach, you've lived through fever, watched a rope burn nearly cost a man his hand, eaten limes on a superstition that happened to be true, and watched your cook hand off his self-taught practice to an actual physician, with something like professional pride rather than resentment. In short, you've survived the entire arc of what medical care meant on a pirate ship with no doctor aboard, from nothing at all to a well-meaning amateur, to, eventually, if you were very lucky, the genuine article taken at gunpoint from someone else's crew. That's the quiet, unglamorous truth sitting underneath every dramatic pirate story you've ever heard. For most of the Golden Age, for most crews, medicine wasn't a surgeon in a clean coat with a bag of instruments. It was a cook with 2 fingers and a guess. And more of you lived through it than you might expect, not because the system worked especially well, but because the men running it, untrained as they were, mostly tried. The next surgeon this story turns to wasn't nearly so reluctant about the life he'd been pulled into, and the choice he made would end up costing him considerably more than a few uncomfortable months at sea. Every crew that lost its cook turned physician to a lucky prize eventually got a real surgeon aboard, sooner or later. Almost none of those surgeons wanted to be there. Peter Scudamore was the exception, and the exception, as it turned out, would cost him everything. Salt spray and the smell of tar rolling off the Royal Fortune's deck in the spring of 1721, that's the last ordinary morning the merchant ship Mercy would ever have. She was out of Bristol running a routine trading circuit, when Bartholomew Roberts' squadron came alongside and took her without much of a fight, which was, by this point in his career, more or less the standard outcome for anyone unlucky enough to cross his path. Roberts would go on to be credited with taking upward of 400 vessels before his career ended the following year, a scale of plunder that dwarfs even the more famous names of the era, Blackbeard included, whose entire recorded career amounted to a fraction of that number. Aboard the Mercy, doing his job as ship surgeon on what should have been an unremarkable Tuesday, was a man named Peter Scudamore. He was 34 years old. Nothing about the record suggests he was anyone special up to that point. No dramatic backstory, no prior brush with piracy. Just a working surgeon on a working ship. He would be dead within the year, and the manner of his death would end up more thoroughly documented, down to the words witnesses swore he'd said, than almost anything else about his life before it. Here's the script that surgeons captured by pirate crews were supposed to follow by 1721. One this story has already traced once with the surgeon taken off the Liverpool ship at the close of the last chapter, visible reluctance. A signature given only under the plain threat of violence. And, if the man played it carefully, and the eventual court was inclined to believe him, an acquittal on the grounds that he'd never truly had a choice in the matter. It was, in its own grim way, a survival strategy, and most captured surgeons understood the stakes well enough to follow it to the letter. Scudamore knew the script as well as anyone in his position could have. According to the testimony later given by his own shipmates, men named Harry Glasby, Joe, Wingfield, and Nicholas Brattle, all of whom would eventually testify against him, he simply declined to follow it. He signed Roberts' articles by their account without needing much persuading at all, and is said to have boasted about it afterward to anyone within earshot. He was, he told them, the first ship's surgeon ever known to sign a pirate's articles entirely of his own free will, and he intended to prove as thorough a rogue as any man among them. It's a strange thing to announce with pride. But piracy in this period offered something a merchant surgeon's contract simply didn't. An equal vote in the ship's affairs, a genuine share of the plunder instead of a fixed and modest wage, and freedom from the rigid discipline of a merchant captain who could have a man flogged for a wrong word at the wrong moment. For a surgeon who'd spent years patching sailors up for someone else's profit, the arithmetic may well have looked appealing the moment somebody actually offered him the choice. Whatever his private reasoning, the pirates aboard the Royal Fortune noticed the difference in him almost immediately, and it's worth sitting with exactly why. A forced man does the job asked of him and quietly counts the days until he can slip away at the next friendly port. That was the norm. And everyone aboard, pirate and prisoner alike, understood the unspoken rules of that arrangement. Scudamore did the job, and then went looking for more. When Roberts' ships took the King Solomon, an African company slaving vessel, Scudamore went aboard with the boarding party himself and helped himself to that ship's own surgeon's instruments and medicines, an act that by the custom described in the previous chapter, most captured surgeons went to considerable lengths to avoid, precisely because looting alongside the pirates erased any later claim to having been an unwilling passenger in their crimes. Scudamore, by every account, made no such effort to hide it. He also took a backgammon board from the same hall, a small, almost comic detail that survives only because another pirate contested his claim to it, and the resulting argument grew heated enough that witnesses remembered it years later at his trial. Scudamore won. The record doesn't say how, though it isn't hard to guess that a man willing to sign a pirate's articles for sport wasn't likely to lose an argument over a board game either. Being useful and unpleasant at the same time turns out to be one of the more reliable paths to promotion, on a pirate ship exactly as it is anywhere else. When Roberts's growing fleet needed a chief surgeon to serve permanently aboard the flagship, the post went, by vote, to Scudamore. And the reason recorded for his selection tells you almost everything you need to know about how his own shipmates actually felt about him. The crew of his own ship, the Ranger, voted for him specifically to be rid of him, since the chief surgeon's position required a permanent transfer to serve alongside the Commodore himself. It's one of the more backhanded promotions in the recorded history of the trade. Not "we trust this man above all others," but "please, someone else, take him off our hands." Scudamore, by the surviving accounts, accepted the honour without appearing to register the insult buried inside it, which tells you something about the man as clearly as anything else in this story does. None of this made him popular. It also, crucially, didn't make him careless about the one thing that mattered most in his new post. By every surviving account, he was genuinely competent at the practice of surgery itself, steady-handed with wounds, careful with what limited medicine the fleet carried, professionally reliable in exactly the way his personal conduct never managed to be. Skill and character, it turns out, were never quite the same requirement, whether the job in question was surgeon or captain or anything in between. For roughly 2.5 years, Bartholomew Roberts's fleet ranged across the Atlantic, first the Caribbean, then the American coast, and finally the waters off West Africa, under a code so strict and so orderly that Roberts himself, a lifelong teetotaler in a profession defined almost entirely by rum, has been described by later historians as running one of the most disciplined operations of the entire Golden Age. Lights and candles out at 8 each evening. Musicians granted rest on the Sabbath, a small mercy for men who otherwise had none. a vote for every decision of consequence, recorded in written articles every man aboard had willingly signed before the anchor was ever raised. It's worth pausing on, because it cuts hard against the image of piracy as pure lawless chaos. The ships under Roberts ran, in their own strange way, more orderly than plenty of legitimate merchant vessels of the same decade. Word of Roberts's fleet moved ahead of it wherever it sailed, the way news always did in this world. Merchant captains swapping stories second-hand in port taverns, each account growing a little more exaggerated in the retelling, of a black-flagged commodore who drank nothing stronger than tea and had never once lost a major engagement. By January of 1722, that reputation had drawn the attention of the one force capable of actually ending it. The Royal Navy sent Swallow, a fourth-rate warship under Captain Challoner Ogle, hunting Roberts specifically along the West African coast, where his fleet had settled in to plunder the region's lucrative and brutal slaving trade. The morning of February 10, 1722, off Cape Lopez in what is now Gabon, brought the hunt to its end. The Swallow caught up with Roberts' flagship, the Royal Fortune, and opened fire at close range. Roberts himself, dressed by most surviving accounts in a crimson waistcoat and a hat trimmed with feathers for the engagement, was killed almost immediately. Struck in the throat by grapeshot while still shouting orders from the quarterdeck, dead, according to his own crew's later testimony, before his body had even finished falling. His men, following his own standing instruction for exactly this circumstance, weighted the body with chain and put it over the side before the Swallow's boarding party could reach the deck, denying the Royal Navy the trophy of his corpse and denying the crowds back in England the spectacle of his execution. Scudamore was not aboard the Royal Fortune for its final fight. In the days before the battle, he had been placed, along with several wounded prisoners and a handful of enslaved Africans the pirates had taken from earlier captured slaving vessels, aboard a smaller prize the Swallow's crew had already secured separately from the main engagement. It should, by any reasonable measure, have been the safest place on the water that day, already effectively captured, already out of the fighting entirely. Instead, it became the setting for the single most damning episode of Scudamore's short career, and the one that would ultimately decide whether he lived or died. According to the sworn testimony of several fellow prisoners at the trial that followed, Glasby, Wingfield and Brattle among them once again, Scudamore used his time aboard the captured prize to attempt something genuinely audacious, a second mutiny aimed at seizing the very ship now holding him and escaping with it before the Swallow's men could carry him back to face judgment. He spoke enough of an Angolan language, picked up over years spent alongside enslaved men taken from Portuguese and English slaving vessels, to lay out his plan directly to some of the Africans held prisoner alongside him, proposing that together they overpower the remaining guard, sail for the African coast, and raise an entirely fresh pirate company from nothing. One of the men he approached, a fellow prisoner named William Child, later gave the court a detailed account of the pitch. Scudamore argued by Child's telling that he understood navigation well enough to teach the rest, and that it was surely better to risk everything on a fresh voyage than to be carried meekly back to Cape Coast Castle to hang. Child wanted no part of it. He wasn't a pirate by his own account, he told Scudamore plainly, and had nothing to fear from the voyage home. The plot collapsed before it could begin. But the attempt itself, a man already effectively condemned, still gambling everything on one more escape rather than simply accepting the ship carrying him toward his own trial, reveals a nerve that's almost admirable, even as it sealed his fate more thoroughly than anything he'd done up to that point. The trial opened on the 28th of March 1722 at Cape Coast Castle on the Gold Coast, a British fortification that would, within a few decades, become one of the grimmest waypoints of the transatlantic slave trade, but which in the spring of 1722 served instead as the site of what later writers would call the largest piracy trial in recorded history. Under a Vice-Admiralty court presided over by Captain Mungo Herdman, 169 prisoners taken from Roberts' two captured vessels were brought forward for judgment over the following weeks, 69 of them from the Great Ranger, whose own captain, James Skirm, arrived at the castle barely alive from wounds taken in the same battle that killed Roberts, and the rest from the Royal Fortune itself, Of those, 91 were ultimately found guilty, 52 would hang. Surgeons, as a class, generally fared better than ordinary crew in courts like this one. The court's own recorded reasoning, drawn from related cases of the period, held that a man of education and a genuinely useful profession was inherently less likely to have joined the pirates by choice than an ordinary seaman with nothing to lose. Surgeons were treated, in the court's own language from a similar case, with a degree of humanity on account of their employment and their better education, which rendered them less immediately suspected of the crime than the men around them. It amounted, in effect, to a professional discount on the presumption of innocence. Scudamore, of anyone standing trial that spring, could have used it most. He had instead spent the better part of 2 years quietly demolishing his own claim to it. The boastful signature, the looting alongside the crew, the attempted mutiny while already a prisoner of the crown. When he stood before Herdman's court and claimed, after all of that, to have been forced into piracy under direct threat from Roberts himself, the surviving witnesses from his own crew told the court a very different story, in considerable and consistent detail, and the court believed them over him. At trial, faced with the accumulating weight of his own reputation, Scudamore finally attempted the standard defence, the same one every other reluctant surgeon in this story had used, and used successfully. He claimed he had been forced from his original ship under a Captain Rolls, taken off Calabar the previous October, and that both Roberts and one of his lieutenants, Valentine Ashplant, had threatened him directly into signing the articles, leaving him no real choice in the matter. It's the correct defence, on paper. It is also, by the court's own patient reconstruction of the evidence, almost certainly false, and undone by Scudamore's own words rather than anyone else's. Witnesses recalled an incident from earlier in the voyage, when Captain Rolls, the very man Scudamore now claimed to have been forcibly separated from, was departing the pirate ship in a small boat just as a sudden squall arose on the water. Rather than express any concern for his supposed former captain's safety, Scudamore was overheard hoping aloud that the man might drown, calling him a rogue who had done everything in his power to turn the other pirates against him. It is not, by any reasonable standard, the reaction of a man pining for the captain who was forcibly torn from him. The court took note. A defence built entirely on having been an unwilling captive rarely survives the captive's own recorded wish that his supposed captor drown at sea. And Scudamore's collapsed accordingly, undone less by any single witness than by the sheer damning consistency of 2 years of his own behaviour. He was condemned to death. What followed, by every surviving account, was almost jarringly different from the man described throughout the rest of the record. The surgeon who had stolen a backgammon board and plotted a jailbreak mutiny while under armed guard spent his final 3 days, granted to him at his own specific request, in what the record describes as near constant prayer and reading of scripture. On the gallows itself, unlike most of the condemned men executed around him that spring, he is said to have sung, alone and unaccompanied, one of the psalms traditionally associated with penitence and the plea for mercy. A final solitary performance in front of a crowd that had gathered specifically to watch men hang. And that likely expected the usual mix of defiance, weeping, or silence rather than a hymn. It's worth pausing here on exactly what we can and can't say with confidence. Much of the vivid, quotable detail from Scudamore's final days comes down to us through Captain Charles Johnson's 1724 General History of the Pirates, a best-selling account published just 2 years after the events it describes, drawing heavily on genuine trial transcripts but written by an author whose own identity remains disputed among historians, and who was, by most modern assessments, not above dramatising a scene for effect where the underlying record allowed room for it. The broad shape of Scudamore's story, the voluntary signature, the looting, the mutiny attempt, the conviction, the execution, is corroborated by surviving trial records independent of Johnson's book. The finer, more theatrical details, the solitary hymn on the gallows chief among them, sit in the more uncertain territory of legend built on a documented foundation rather than settled fact in their own right. What happened to Scudamore's body afterward likely followed the same practice applied to the worst regarded of Robert's crew that spring. 18 of the men judged the gravest offenders were dipped in tar, bound into iron frames, and hung in chains from gibbets on the hills overlooking the harbour, left on display for passing ships as a warning against following the same path. A fate. Incidentally also handed to Israel Hands, once a lieutenant under Blackbeard himself, whose survival of one infamous crew only delivered him, years later, to the gallows of another. Whether Scudamore's own body received that particular indignity isn't recorded with total certainty, but the general practice at Cape Coast Castle that spring makes it a reasonable likelihood. What outlived him, more reliably than his body, was his profession's most damning verdict on him. Among every surgeon captured across the whole of Robert's sprawling crew, and there were at least 7 identifiable medical men who served the fleet at one point or another, contemporary accounts single Scudamore out specifically as the only one known to have joined the pirates entirely by his own will, without threat or coercion from anyone. Every other ship's doctor in this particular story, the reluctant men taken from other vessels and desperate to prove their innocence later, gets remembered by history, when remembered at all, with a measure of sympathy the record never once extends to Peter Scudamore. There's one final, unlikely place Scudamore's story survives, more than a century and a half after Cape Coast Castle, in fiction. When Robert Louis Stevenson sat down to write Treasure Island in 1881, he gave his most memorable character, the one-legged Long John Silver, a very specific origin for his missing limb, amputated according to Silver's own account within the novel, by a ship's surgeon who had sailed with Bartholomew Roberts' crew and was later hanged at Cape Coast Castle. Stevenson wasn't inventing his pirate history out of nothing. He was drawing, however loosely and second-hand, on precisely the record this chapter has followed. Scudamore's trial, his role as chief surgeon of Robert's fleet, his death on the gallows in the spring of 1722, and folding it into a fictional leg that has since gone on to outlive almost everything true about the man who supposedly took it off. It's a strange kind of afterlife for someone his own shipmates voted, quite literally, to be rid of. Somewhere in the gap between a genuine 18th century trial record and a 19th century adventure novel written more than 150 years later, Peter Scudamore, surgeon, looter, failed mutineer, penitent on the gallows, became, without ever intending to, one of the small threads still holding up the entire modern idea of what a pirate even is. Not every captured surgeon met that fate, or earned it, and most went to remarkable lengths to avoid ever standing anywhere near Scudamore's position at trial. One particular physician never had to worry about that reckoning at all. He never set foot on a genuine pirate deck in the first place, and instead spent his own strange voyage rescuing a castaway whose survival story would go on to outlast every pirate legend in this chapter combined. Not every pirate who lost a doctor's care lost quite as much as the men in this next story lost, because on this particular ship there had never been a doctor to begin with, not even briefly, and the job of keeping a man alive fell entirely to whoever happened to be standing closest, with the steadiest hands and the least amount of formal qualification to be trusted with the task. Salt-cured rope, hot pitch, and under it all the faint sourness of a bilge that hasn't been pumped dry in a week, that's the smell of the Revenge on an ordinary morning in April of 1724, and it's the smell that greets you as you climb up from below to relieve the watch. Captain John Phillips runs a tight, uneasy ship, and for good reason. Most of his crew, yourself included, were taken up against their will from captured merchant vessels over the past year, forced men serving under a captain who trusts almost none of them and has the written articles to prove it. Working the deck near you this particular morning is a boy of perhaps 14 named Davy Hollis, a powder monkey whose entire job during a fight consists of running black powder cartridges from the ship's magazine up to the gun crews, a task given specifically to boys because they were quick on their feet and small enough to move fast through the cramped, low passages where a grown man would lose precious seconds he didn't have to spare. Davy has been aboard 8 months now. He still flinches, faintly but unmistakably, at the sound of the guns being run out for drill, and nobody aboard blames him for it, because most of them still flinch too, in their own quieter ways. There is no surgeon aboard the Revenge, and there never has been for this entire cruise. Philip's own written articles, which every man aboard signed under one degree of pressure or another, say almost nothing about how the crew is meant to handle that particular gap in their arrangements, an oversight buried among 16 far more detailed rules about theft and desertion and the treatment of captured women. That is about to become extraordinarily expensive. By mid-morning, a sail is spotted on the horizon, and by noon you're in the middle of a fight, a merchant vessel off the coast, resisting capture with considerably more determination than Philip's crew had bargained for, trading musket fire and small cannon shot across a stretch of water that closes faster with every exchange than anyone aboard would like. The noise alone is disorienting, the flat crack of muskets, the deeper concussion of the guns, men shouting orders that get lost half-formed in the wind. Captain Phillips, directing the engagement from close to the rail where he can see the enemy deck clearly, takes a musket ball through the leg. He goes down hard, and for a few chaotic minutes, the fight simply continues around him while two of the crew drag him below, out of the line of fire, and lay him out on whatever flat surface happens to be nearest. In this case, the mess table, still faintly sticky from that morning's breakfast. Here's the part of this story that separates it from an ordinary wound, and it's worth understanding clearly before the rest of it unfolds. Everyone crowded into that low cabin understands, almost immediately and without needing to be told, what has to happen next. A ball through the meat of an arm or a shoulder might heal cleanly on its own, given rest, a decent bandage, and a fair amount of luck. A shattered leg bone driven through by a musket ball at close range does not heal that way. Left untreated, the wound festers within days, the tissue around it blackens and dies, and the infection spreads upward through the body until it kills the man attached to it, a death considerably slower, and by every account considerably worse than the amputation itself. Someone has to take the leg off, and take it off soon, before shock and blood loss make the decision for everyone in that cabin, whether they're ready or not. What follows next is recorded, in the later account drawn from the crew's own testimony, as a learned consultation, which is a generous, almost comic way of describing a handful of untrained. Frightened sailors standing over their captain's bleeding leg in a low-ceilinged cabin, arguing in raised voices about who among them was least likely to make an already terrible situation worse. There was no surgeon to appoint. Obviously, their absence was the entire crisis in the first place. So the crew settled, by rough and hurried consensus, on the man best suited to the job by virtue of an entirely unrelated trade: Thomas Fenn, the ship's carpenter. It's not as strange a choice as it might first sound, and it's worth taking seriously rather than treating purely as gallows humour. A carpenter aboard a wooden ship of this period was, by daily trade, intimately familiar with saws, with the mechanics of cutting cleanly and quickly through dense material under pressure, and, crucially, with working fast under difficult conditions, because a slow, hesitant carpenter aboard a leaking ship in a storm was a genuine liability to everyone aboard. None of that experience translates cleanly to human anatomy, and every man crowded into that cabin understood the gap perfectly well. But of the hands available to them in that moment, Fenn's were the steadiest, and steady hands, in the total absence of anything resembling real surgical training, were the only qualification anyone aboard the Revenge had left to offer their captain. This next part deserves to be told plainly, without the dry aside that might otherwise soften it in the telling, because softening it would do a disservice to what John Phillips actually endured that afternoon. There was no anaesthesia beyond whatever rum could be scrounged from below decks in the few minutes available, and rum dulls pain at the margins. It does not come close to erasing it. 2 or 3 men held Phillips down bodily across the mess table, pinning his arms and his uninjured leg as firmly as they could manage, while Fenn fetched the largest saw from his own tool chest. The very same saw he used, on ordinary days, for cutting planking and framing, and set to work just above the wound. According to the account later preserved from the crew's own sworn testimony, he separated the leg from the rest of Philip's body, in roughly the time it would have taken him to saw cleanly through a deal board, start to finish. It is, by any measure available to us now, an extraordinarily short span of time in which to perform what remains, even with modern anaesthesia, one of the most physically traumatic procedures a human body can survive. Speed in this specific and narrow context actually functioned as a form of mercy. However grim that mercy looked from the outside, a slow, hesitant cut prolongs the agony without meaningfully improving the outcome for the patient underneath the blade. Whatever else can fairly be said about Thomas Fenn's total lack of surgical training that day, nobody among the crew who later testified accused him of hesitating when it mattered most. The bleeding, once the leg was fully off, presented its own separate and immediate crisis, and the fix for it was every bit as crude as the amputation that preceded it. Fenn heated a hatchet directly in the galley fire until the metal glowed a dull orange, then pressed the flat of the blade firmly against the open wound to cauterize it, sealing the severed blood vessels through nothing more sophisticated than raw, applied heat. Because there was no proper cautery iron anywhere aboard the ship. The smell alone, by any reasonable modern comparison, would have cleared a hospital operating theatre in seconds. Phillips, by every surviving account of the incident, remained conscious through most of the procedure, or very nearly so, a detail that says as much about the man's constitution as it does about the crude mercy of the rum he'd been given beforehand. He did not, unfortunately, come through the ordeal entirely unscathed, even by the already low standards of the day. The later account specifically notes that Fenn, for all the steady skill he'd shown with the saw itself, was considerably less careful with the hatchet that followed. He burned flesh well beyond the immediate margin of the amputation, badly enough that infection very nearly claimed what remained of the leg regardless of how cleanly the initial cut had gone. In the end, the surviving record credits nature rather than medicine with Philip's actual recovery. The wound healed, slowly and by every indication painfully, without any other assistance. As the crew's own later testimony rather dryly put it, a polite 18th century way of saying that their captain lived because his own body eventually won a fight that Fenn's glowing hatchet had come dangerously close to losing for him. 3 days out from the engagement, and while Phillips recovers below in a fever that comes and goes with the tide, you finally get a proper look at what actually happened to Davy Hollis during that same chaotic fight. Because the boy has been quietly favouring his left hand ever since, tucking it awkwardly into his shirt whenever anyone glances his way, and doing his level best not to mention it to a single soul aboard. Splinters, as it happens, were the real and reliably underrated killer in a naval engagement of this era, arguably more dangerous in aggregate than the cannonballs that caused them. A ball striking a wooden hull didn't simply punch a clean hole straight through the timber, it drove a violent spray of jagged wooden fragments, some of them a foot long or more, across the deck at a speed close to that of the shot itself, and a man standing in exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong moment could be shredded by his own ship's splintered planking without an enemy musket ball ever coming near him directly. Davy caught a smaller, luckier version of exactly that, a splinter roughly the length of a finger, driven clean through the webbing between 2 fingers on his left hand during the worst of the exchange. Rather than stop and be seen, even for a moment, as the boy who couldn't stomach a real fight, he'd simply wrapped the wound in a torn strip of his own shirt and kept running powder cartridges up from the magazine, gritting his teeth through every trip. 6 days out, and the wound in Davy's hand has gone visibly bad, hot to the touch, swollen tight across the knuckle, weeping in a way that even the least medically informed man aboard can recognise, on sight, as a genuine problem rather than an ordinary scrape. It's you who notices it first, catching sight of him winking sharply as he hauls on a line during morning watch. And it's you, in the end, who finally corners him and makes him show you the hand properly, over his own quiet, embarrassed protests. What you find isn't good. The skin surrounding the entry wound has gone an angry, deepening shade of red that's already begun spreading up past the wrist, and Davy admits, only when pressed hard enough, that he hasn't been able to properly close his fist in nearly 2 full days. There's no surgeon for this either, of course, and Thomas Fenn, still visibly shaken by what he'd been forced to do to his own captain less than a week earlier, wants absolutely no part of performing a second operation on anyone, especially not a 14-year-old boy. It falls, in the end, to the simplest and least dramatic remedy available to the crew. Someone digs the remaining fragment of splinter out with a knife blade heated over a lamp. Someone else packs the open wound with what little vinegar remains in the ship's meagre medicine stores, and Davy is told, in blunt and entirely unsentimental terms, to keep the hand as clean and as still as he can possibly manage aboard a ship where nothing ever truly stays still. He loses the full use of one finger permanently. He does not lose the hand, and on this particular ship, on this particular voyage, that alone counts as a genuine victory. By the time the Revenge makes port some 3 weeks later, both Phillips and Davy are, against fairly steep odds, alive and visibly mending. And it's here, finally, that the ship's articles, the written constitution every man aboard had signed, however unwillingly, before this cruise ever began, do the one thing they were actually designed to do in a moment, exactly like this one. Philip's own set of 16 rules specified, in plain and deliberate language, exactly what a man was owed for, or exactly this kind of misfortune. 400 pieces of 8 for the loss of a joint taken in an engagement, 800 for the loss of an entire limb. Phillips, as captain, doesn't draw from the common stock in quite the same formal, ceremonial way an ordinary crewman would have. His position already entitled him to a considerably larger share of any prize regardless of injury. But Davy Hollis, forced aboard 8 months earlier with nothing whatsoever to his name, stands before the ship's quartermaster and receives a payment scaled down from the full 400 pieces, a partial sum reflecting his partial injury, exactly as the articles had promised for lesser hurts. Proportionably, it isn't a fortune, not by any measure. It is, for a 14-year-old boy who arrived on this ship owning nothing but the clothes on his back, the first money he has ever held that was entirely, undeniably his own, and you watch him count it twice over in front of you, slowly, as though a third count might make the coins disappear. No reliable statistics survive specifically from pirate crews on how many men lived through an amputation like Phillips's rather than dying of the shock, the blood loss, or the infection that so often followed. Pirates, by their nature, kept few careful medical records, and burned the ones they did keep whenever capture looked likely. What does survive from the more thoroughly documented world of the Royal Navy across the same rough decades suggests the odds were something close to a coin flip even under a trained surgeon's care, and considerably worse under a carpenter's. Phillips beat those odds. Not every pirate who lost a limb to a saw and a hot blade did. Consider Israel Hands, mentioned briefly in the previous chapter, as one of the men hanged in chains at Cape Coast Castle, and better remembered today as a lieutenant under Blackbeard himself. Hans' most famous injury didn't come from an enemy engagement at all. By the account that survives, Blackbeard shot him through the knee under his own table one evening, deliberately and for no clearer reason than to remind the rest of the crew, without needing to say a word, exactly what kind of captain they served under. Hans was carried ashore for treatment rather than operated on at sea, which, by the grim arithmetic of this chapter, likely saved both his leg and his life. He was recovering on land, and away from Blackbeard's ship entirely. When his old captain was finally killed the following year off Ocracoke Island, a stroke of timing that some later writers have credited, only half joking, with saving Hans from the noose as thoroughly as it saved him from the leg. He is said to have lived out his later years as a beggar on the streets of London, which is its own quiet. Unglamorous postscript to a man who survived the very worst that two different pirate captains could throw at him. There's something worth pausing on here, in the quiet space that opens up after Davy's small payout, that the rest of this particular story hasn't had much room for until now: genuine tenderness, arriving from an unlikely and entirely unsentimental direction. Nobody aboard the Revenge holds a ceremony for the boy, nobody makes a speech, or marks the occasion in any way that would show up in a captain's log. But in the days that follow, you notice, almost by accident, the older hands quietly covering his lighter duties while the hand finishes healing, without complaint and without anyone having to ask them to do it, an unspoken kindness from men who, by any fair accounting, had no particular reason to extend it to a boy none of them had personally chosen to have aboard in the first place. It isn't a village looking after its own, because a pirate crew was never that kind of community. It's something narrower, and in its own quiet way more remarkable still, men bound together by nothing more than shared risk and a signed piece of paper, choosing, entirely without instruction, to look out for the smallest and least protected person among them anyway. Phillips himself would not live out the year. In the spring of 1724, roughly 12 months after taking his own leg off on his own mess table, he was killed in a mutiny led by several of his own forced men, a detail that closes his personal story with a certain grim symmetry, given how many of his crew, Davy Hollis very much included, had never wanted to be standing on his deck in the first place. What became of Davy Hollis afterward isn't recorded anywhere that survives. Most forced boys who lived through their pirate service simply vanished back into the ordinary, undocumented record of merchant sailors and dockworkers, their one strange and violent chapter at sea never mentioned again by anyone, which, weighed against the far grimmer endings available to men throughout the rest of this story, might reasonably be counted as something close to a happy ending after all. Amputation by carpenter's saw and glowing hatchet was, by any modern standard imaginable, an outright horror. It was also, aboard ships like the Revenge, simply an unusually bad Tuesday, and the men who performed it, entirely untrained and improvising with nothing but the tools their actual trades had already given them, were about to look almost enviable next to what awaited crews unlucky enough to catch not a single musket ball, but a fever that swept through an entire ship, deck to deck, with absolutely nothing standing in its way. That kind of fever didn't need a battle to arrive. It needed only a bad cask of water, a mosquito, or a port call in the wrong harbour at the wrong time of year, and the men who eventually sailed into exactly that kind of trouble would come to envy Phillips his clean, decisive, single afternoon of agony. Fevers that swept an entire ship, deck to deck, rarely announced themselves as clearly as a single musket ball did, and the men who eventually fought them almost never had the luxury of one single decisive afternoon like the one that took John Phillips' leg, and in the end left him alive to tell of it. But before this story turns to that kind of slow, creeping disaster, it's worth meeting one of the few university-trained physicians who ever willingly went to sea in a ship's company that included pirates, prizes, and a marooned castaway who would go on to outlive every one of them in the popular imagination. Bristol in the first years of the 18th century was a city with entirely too many wealthy merchants and entirely too few physicians to treat them, and Thomas Dover had built a thriving, lucrative practice out of exactly that imbalance. Born in Warwickshire in 1660, educated at Cambridge, and by his own account a friend and probable pupil of Thomas Sydenham, one of the most respected physicians in England at the time, sometimes called the father of English medicine, Dover had settled in Bristol and, by the early 1700s, was seeing as many as 25 patients a day during outbreaks of typhus, a volume of work that speaks less to any particular genius on his part than to the sheer, grinding scarcity of qualified doctors in a fast-growing port city. He had money. He had a fashionable house in Queen Square, in one of the most desirable addresses in the entire city, shared with his neighbour and future business partner Woodes Rogers. He had, by most accounts, a forceful and occasionally abrasive personality, the kind that served him well arguing with wealthy patients over their treatment, and rather less well in the close quarters of a ship's council chamber. And in 1708, at the age of 48, no longer a young man by the standards of the day, and with a comfortable, respectable medical career he could easily have coasted through for another 2 decades, he decided to give a meaningful portion of both his fortune and his safety up entirely, to go privateering around the world on the strength of one explorer's persuasive pitch. The opportunity came from William Dampier, a navigator and explorer who arrived in Bristol that year hoping to finance one more expedition against Spanish shipping in the Pacific, his third such voyage, and, given the failures of the previous two, not an obviously safe investment for anyone involved. Dover bought in anyway, contributing $3,312 to the venture, the second largest single investment among 30 backers, and in exchange secured himself the rank of second captain aboard the Duke, one of 2 ships in the expedition, under the overall command of a younger, considerably more experienced sea captain named Woodes Rogers. Here's the first thing worth understanding about Thomas Dover's role aboard the Duke, because it cuts directly against what the chapter's premise might lead you to expect. Despite being a fully trained physician, and despite investing more money into the voyage than almost anyone aboard, Dover held no formal medical charge on this expedition at all. The Duke and her sister ship the Duchess carried 6 separate men in medical roles between them, including a Dutch-trained physician and surgeon named James Wasay, a doctor named John Ballet who'd previously sailed with Dampier, and Dover's own brother-in-law serving as apothecary, and Dover, for all his credentials, was not formally counted among them. His actual authority came from his money and his social standing, not his medical degree. He served instead as captain of the Marines and president of the voyage's governing council, with something close to a co-command over Rogers himself. That distinction mattered enormously once the voyage actually got underway, because it meant that when Dover did weigh in on medical matters, he did so as an investor and council president, throwing his considerable weight around, rather than as the ship's working physician quietly treating patients below decks. And weigh in he did, on precisely the subject where his university training would prove least useful and most stubbornly, expensively wrong. Scurvy took hold of the crew early, as it did on nearly every long ocean voyage of the era, the men's gums softening and blackening, old wounds reopening, teeth loosening in their sockets as the weeks without fresh food stretched on. Dover, drawing on the formal medical theory of his day, insisted that alum, a mineral salt with genuine astringent properties, useful for treating minor cuts and not remotely useful against a dietary deficiency, was an infallible preventative against the disease. He said so with the full confidence of a Cambridge-trained physician citing established medical science, because, as far as the established medical science of 1708 was concerned, he wasn't wrong to think alum belonged somewhere in the conversation. Woodes Rogers, who held no medical training whatsoever and had never claimed any, simply ignored him and stocked the ships with limes whenever the opportunity arose in port. It's a small, almost absurdly quiet moment in the historical record. No confrontation is recorded, no dramatic argument logged in anyone's journal. But it's a genuinely useful one for understanding exactly how much of effective shipboard medicine in this era came down to a captain's practical, hard-won intuition rather than a physician's formal theory. Nobody aboard the Duke understood why citrus worked. The connection to what we'd now call vitamin C wouldn't be established for another 2 centuries. Rogers simply knew, from years at sea and the accumulated folk wisdom of 100 captains before him, that ships which carried citrus lost fewer men, and that was reason enough. The doctor was wrong. The sea captain, guessing correctly for reasons he couldn't have explained, was right. History, with its usual fondness for a good nickname, would eventually remember Thomas Dover as Dr. Quicksilver, a reference to his enthusiastic lifelong faith in mercury-based treatments, a mainstay of 18th century medicine that ranged from genuinely useful in small controlled doses for certain conditions to actively poisonous in the considerably less controlled doses Dover was known to favour. It's tempting to read this forward through modern eyes as simple quackery, and in fairness, some of it plainly was. But it's worth remembering that Dover was operating at the very edge of what formal medical science understood in 1708, a science still built largely on the theory of 4 bodily humours that needed to be kept in balance, still centuries away from germ theory, still guessing, with the best tools and best minds it had available at why bodies got sick and what might set them right again. Alum for scurvy and mercury for nearly everything else weren't outliers in Dover's practice. They were the actual mainstream medicine of his day, taught at Cambridge and practiced by physicians considerably less adventurous than he was. What set Dover apart from his more conventional colleagues wasn't bad theory so much as a genuine willingness to test that theory against the world in person, at real cost to himself, rather than simply prescribing from the comfort of a Bristol consulting room. Few physicians of his generation risked 3,312 of their own money and 3 years of their own life on a voyage this dangerous. Fewer still ended up leading an armed shore party into unknown territory, or receiving command of a captured galleon, purely on the strength of having invested wisely and argued persuasively in council meetings. Whatever else can be said about Dr. Quicksilver's medical judgment, his nerve was never seriously in question. On the 2nd of February 1709, the Duke and Duchess anchored off the Juan Fernandez Islands, a remote and uninhabited archipelago some 400 miles off the coast of Chile, to take on fresh water and repair storm damage. That evening, a light was spotted on shore, and the ship's officers, wary of a Spanish ambush, sent an armed party to investigate. Thomas Dover led it. 6 armed men rowed ashore in the fading light toward a fire that, for all anyone aboard actually knew, might have been lit by an enemy patrol waiting to spring a trap. What they found instead was a man, Alexander Selkirk, a Scottish sailor who had been marooned on the island 4 years and 4 months earlier, at his own request, after a bitter dispute with the captain of his previous ship, the Cinque-Ports, over its seaworthiness, a dispute in which Selkirk, as it turned out, had been entirely correct. The vessel he'd refused to sail on had sunk within a month of leaving him behind, with the loss of most of her crew. Dover's party found him dressed in goatskins, half feral from years without human company, catching 2 or 3 wild goats a day to survive on an island where he'd had no company at all beyond his own thoughts and, eventually, a number of feral cats he tamed to help keep the island's rats from gnawing at him while he slept. Selkirk was, by every account, nearly incoherent with joy at the sight of other men, so out of practice at speech itself that Roger's own journal noted he could barely make himself understood at first. Selkirk's rescue did more than simply add a remarkable survival story to Roger's eventual account of the voyage, though it certainly did that too. Selkirk's 4 years of self-sufficient hunting and foraging turned out to be exactly what the scurvy, weakened crew of both ships desperately needed. He knew the island's resources intimately, where the freshest water ran, which plants were safe to eat, how to hunt the wild goats efficiently enough to keep 2 ships' worth of men fed on fresh meat. Broth made from his catch, combined with wild turnip tops and other greens he pointed the crew toward, did more to restore the men's health in a matter of days than Dover's alum had managed in the entire preceding voyage, a detail the ship's own journals record with a certain understated satisfaction. It would be more than a decade before Daniel Defoe, a friend of Woodes Rogers and an eager reader of his eventual published account, would transform Selkirk's ordeal into the life and surprising adventures of Robinson Crusoe, but the raw material for one of the most enduring castaway stories in the English language was at this exact moment simply a hungry, sunburned man helping to nurse a ship's crew back to health with wild goat broth. The expedition's fortunes took a considerably darker turn 2 months later, in April of 1709, when the council resolved to raid the Spanish town of Guayaquil, in what is now Ecuador, a decision driven less by strategy than by simple logistics, since the privateers had by then accumulated more than 300 captives from earlier seized vessels and were running desperately short of food to keep them fed. Dover led one of the shore parties during the raid, pushing up the Guayas River after wealthy residents who had fled the town with whatever valuables they could carry, including, by the surviving accounts, jewels and gold hidden within their own clothing. It is not the most flattering episode in Dover's story, and this account won't pretend otherwise. Privateering, for all its legal cover under wartime commissions and the Crown's blessing, still meant armed men terrorising civilians for profit, however the paperwork dressed it up. Rogers himself was wounded in the jaw during the broader engagement around the same operation, a wound serious enough that he carried the scar for the rest of his life. The raid also cost the expedition something harder to measure than gold, time, and the health of the men who'd only just begun recovering from scurvy at Juan Fernandez. 300 captives needed feeding and guarding, even as the privateers pressed inland after a town largely emptied of its wealth before they arrived, forewarned by riders sent ahead. Dysentery and fever, The same shipboard afflictions that would plague every crew in this story sooner or later spread quickly through the crowded, sweltering conditions the raid created, undoing in weeks some of the fragile health Selkirk's goat broth had only just restored. It's a pattern worth noticing, because it recurs constantly throughout this entire history. Disease rarely struck pirate and privateering crews as some separate, unrelated misfortune. It struck hardest exactly when greed, ambition, or desperation pushed a crew into crowded ships, foreign harbours, and decisions that had nothing to do with medicine at all. The expedition's genuine climax came that December, when the Duke and Duchess finally cornered a rich Spanish prize off the coast of Mexico, the Nuestra Señora de la Encarnación y Deseñao, a vessel valuable enough that her capture alone would go a long way toward justifying the entire 3-year voyage to its 30 nervous investors back in Bristol. The privateers took her, though not without cost, and not without losing her much larger and better armed companion galleon, the Nuestra Señora de Bagoa, which escaped after a brutal exchange that damaged both of Roger's own ships badly enough that one officer later compared attacking her hull to attacking a fortress rather than a ship. What followed was, by Roger's own account, one of the tensest council meetings of the entire voyage. Who would command the new prize for the long crossing home? It was no small decision. A captured galleon needed a captain who could be trusted not to run her aground, not to mishandle her cargo, and not to squander the single richest prize the entire 3-year voyage had produced, all while sailing thousands of miles of open ocean, largely out of Roger's direct sight. After what the record describes as a heated debate among the ship's officers, men who had, by this point in the voyage, argued over nearly everything else worth arguing about, the command went, somewhat reluctantly on Roger's part, to Thomas Dover, the investor, the council president. The physician who'd gotten scurvy badly wrong and Selkirk's rescue thoroughly right, now handed an entire captured galleon, renamed the Bachelor, to sail home across the widest ocean on Earth. Roger's misgivings may have been eased by his choice of sailing master for the voyage, Alexander Selkirk himself, 4 years marooned and newly restored to a life at sea. Now serving directly under the man who'd led the party that found him half wild in goatskins on a forgotten island. The 3-year expedition finally limped home to England in October of 1711, having circumnavigated the globe by way of the Pacific, the Dutch East Indies, and the Cape of Good Hope, an extraordinary feat of endurance for 2 aging, storm-battered ships that had, by any reasonable measure, no business surviving the journey intact. When the accumulated prizes were finally divided among the 30 original investors, Thomas Dover's share came to 6,689, a genuine fortune in 1711 terms, worth well over £1 million by modern reckoning. He had gone to see a wealthy Bristol physician gambling on a dangerous, speculative venture. He came home considerably wealthier, and, perhaps more importantly for the story history would eventually tell about him, famous. Dover didn't rest on that fortune for long. He briefly toured Europe, resumed his medical practice in Bristol, and eventually relocated to London in 1720, where the following year he was formally admitted as a licentiate of the Royal College of Physicians, a credential, unlike his privateering exploits, that rested entirely on his actual medical work. It was during these later years that he developed the diaphoretic remedy that would carry his name into medical use for the following 2 centuries. Dover's powder, a mixture built around opium and ipecacuanha, prescribed for colds and fevers well into the 20th century, however different its exact formulation eventually became from Dover's own original recipe. Published in his 1732 book The Ancient Physician's Legacy, a work that historians generally agree contains little of lasting medical value except for that one enduring recipe. A man who'd gotten scurvy wrong at sea, who'd insisted on a lum while a sea captain with no medical training quietly proved him wrong with a crate of limes, ended up, decades later, getting something else right enough that it outlived him by 200 years, prescribed in households and hospitals long after anyone remembered the name of the ship that made him rich enough to spend his later career perfecting it. There's a final piece to this story, though, and it belongs less to Thomas Dover than to the castaway he rescued. and it circles this whole chapter back, in a way neither man could possibly have anticipated, to exactly the kind of ship without a Dr. Crisis this story keeps returning to. Alexander Selkirk went on, after his rescue and his brief second career as a privateer under Dover's own command, to serve as an officer aboard the Royal Navy vessel Weymouth, patrolling for pirates off the west coast of Africa in 1721. It was miserable, disease-ridden duty. Men sent ashore to cut wood in the Gambia region began falling to yellow fever and likely typhoid in the swarming mosquito season, dying in such numbers by September that the crew erected a makeshift hospital ashore near a British fortification to hold the sick and dying. A fortification called Cape Coast Castle, the very same fort where, only months earlier, Peter Scudamore had sung a psalm on the gallows. Selkirk fell ill that November with the same symptoms as his dying shipmates. He died on the 13th of December 1721 and was buried at sea alongside another crewman who died the same day. 3 more men followed the day after. The real Robinson Crusoe, the man who had survived 4 years and 4 months completely alone on an uninhabited island through nothing but his own resourcefulness, and who had once helped nurse an entire ship's company back from scurvy with wild goat broth, died, in the end, of a fever no doctor aboard his own ship could stop, within sight of the same African coastline where this story's earlier surgeons had already met, their own very different ends. Wonder and dread, it turns out, were never as far apart in this era as they might seem. Sometimes they belonged to exactly the same man, a few years apart, on 2 entirely different ships. Woodes Rogers, the sea captain who trusted his own eyes over his physician's medical theory and kept his crew stocked with limes, would go on to a second and far stranger career of his own within a decade of docking in England, one that would put him in direct command of the most notorious pirate haven in the entire Atlantic world, and would test everything this story has shown so far about disease, medicine, and the limits of what sheer determination alone could accomplish against an enemy that no cutlass, no council vote, and no crate of limes could ever fully defeat. An enemy that no cutlass could touch rarely arrived with any warning at all, and of everything that could slowly unmake a pirate crew over the course of a long voyage, nothing did it more quietly, or more thoroughly, than the disease this next chapter turns to. Your gums bleed a little the first time you notice it, a faint metallic taste mixing with the salt pork you're chewing on a Tuesday that feels, in every other respect, entirely ordinary, the same creak of timbers, the same distant call of a lookout, the same long stretch of empty horizon in every direction you care to look. You don't think much of it. Sailors' gums bleed for all sorts of small reasons. A piece of hardtack biscuit harder than it should be, a rough edge on a broken tooth you've been meaning to deal with for months. You spit, rinse your mouth with a swallow of small beer, and go back to your watch, filing the sensation away with 100 other minor discomforts that come with a life spent at sea. What you don't know yet, because almost nobody aboard this ship has any reliable way of knowing it, is that you've just experienced the first symptom of the single most common killer of long voyage sailors in this entire era. A disease that would, over the course of the 18th century, claim more lives at sea than storms, shipwrecks, and enemy action combined. It has a name. Nobody aboard uses it with any particular dread yet, because right now, on day 1, it doesn't look like anything worth dreading. That's rather the point. Provisioning a pirate ship for a long cruise meant salt beef and salt pork packed tight in barrels of brine, hardtack biscuit baked hard enough to survive months without spoiling, dried peas, and whatever small beer or watered rum the hold could carry to keep men from drinking straight from a water cask that had likely gone foul weeks earlier, breeding whatever unseen life takes hold in standing water left too long in a wooden barrel. None of it, not one item in the entire provisioning list, contains any meaningful amount of what modern science would eventually identify as vitamin C, the nutrient your body needs to keep producing collagen, the protein that holds skin, blood vessels, and connective tissue together. Fresh fruit and vegetables spoiled within days at sea and simply weren't carried in any quantity once a ship left port behind. So from the very first week of a long cruise, your body begins drawing down a reserve of vitamin C that took your entire life on land to build up, and that reserve, unlike most things aboard this ship, cannot be replenished by rum, prayer, or the ship's articles. This is the part that would have astonished any sailor of this era. Had anyone been able to explain it to them, scurvy isn't caused by bad air, or bad luck, or the wrath of God for a sinful crew, all explanations that circulated freely aboard ships like this one. It's caused, simply and mechanically, by the absence of a handful of fresh vegetables the crew hasn't seen since they last stood on dry land. Sailors of this era, lacking any real scientific explanation for what was happening to their bodies, filled the gap the way people always have, with superstition and with theories that at least offered the comfort of an explanation, however wrong. Some blamed the ship's own foul air, the same miasma theory that shadowed nearly every disease of the period, insisting that a properly ventilated berth deck might ward the sickness off entirely, a belief that, while wrong about the mechanism, at least had the accidental side benefit of encouraging cleaner, better-aired living quarters. Others blamed simple homesickness, a kind of melancholy so severe it supposedly poisoned the blood from within. A theory that captured something true about the disease's genuine psychological toll without coming anywhere near its actual cause. A few of the more superstitious hands aboard your own ship mutter that it's a curse laid on any crew that stays too long away from land, gone soft and rotten the way fruit left too long in a barrel goes soft and rotten, an image that is, in its own unintentional way, closer to the truth than any of the others, just backward, blaming the absence of land itself rather than the absence of what land alone could provide. None of these theories saved a single life, but they did something else worth noticing. They gave a frightened, half-informed crew a shared story to tell each other in the dark, something to hold on to besides the raw, unexplained fact of their own bodies slowly falling apart around them. By your third week, without fresh provisions, the bleeding gums you dismissed on day one have become impossible to ignore. They've pulled back visibly from your teeth, swollen and tender to the point that eating the ship's already unpleasant biscuit has become a genuine ordeal rather than a minor annoyance, each bite arriving with a fresh, coppery sting you've started dreading before you've even lifted the biscuit to your mouth. A crewmate 2 hammocks down, a Dutch sailor everyone aboard calls Anders Voss for reasons nobody quite remembers anymore, has it worse than you. His gums have gone a deep, alarming purple, and when he laughs at something during the evening meal, you notice, with a small private jolt of unease, that one of his teeth has come loose enough to wobble visibly in its socket. Voss has been at sea longer than most of this crew, a forced man originally taken off a Rotterdam merchantman nearly a year ago, who simply never found the right moment to slip away and go home. He's become, in that time, something like the ship's unofficial elder statesman, not through any formal rank, but through the accumulated authority of a man who has survived more voyages than anyone else aboard and isn't shy about saying so. Watching scurvy take hold of him first, and worst, feels like watching the ship's own resilience quietly starting to crack. By week 5, the disease has moved past your gums and teeth and into territory that unsettles you far more. An old rope burn scar on Anders Voss's forearm healed over cleanly. By his own account, more than 2 years earlier, has reopened on its own, weeping and raw, as though the wound itself was somehow remembering an injury his body no longer had the material to keep closed. It's one of the disease's strangest and most disturbing effects, though nobody aboard this ship has the vocabulary to explain why it happens. Without enough vitamin C to keep producing new collagen, the body can't maintain the connective tissue holding old long-healed wounds shut, and scars that have sat quietly for years can, under severe enough deficiency, simply come apart again. Voss shows you the reopened scar without much visible alarm, more curious than afraid, turning his arm over in the lamplight as though examining a stranger's injury rather than his own. Never seen the like, he tells you, which is, in its own understated way, the most frightening thing anyone on this ship has said to you all voyage. Because if a man with Voss's years of hard experience has never seen a wound do this before, nobody aboard has the faintest idea what happens next, or how far the disease intends to go before it either kills a man or lets him go. You find yourself, in the days that follow, quietly checking your own arms and legs for old scars of your own, a fading rope burn from your first month aboard, a thin white line across one knuckle from a knife that slipped while gutting fish, half expecting each one to weep open the way Vosses did. None of them do. Not yet, and the waiting itself becomes its own particular kind of dread, not the sharp, immediate fear of a fight, but the slower, more corrosive fear of watching your own body for a betrayal you can't predict and can't prevent, with nothing to do in the meantime but keep working and keep watching. By week 7, the disease has reached past the body and into something closer to the mind, and this is the part later, more thoroughly documented naval accounts from later in the century would eventually describe with real precision. Sailors of a British naval expedition a few decades after this one, chronicling the exact same affliction aboard their own scurvy-ravaged ships, described crewmen falling into a strange, heavy apathy, men who wept without any clear cause, who lost all appetite for food they'd have devoured eagerly a month earlier, who simply lay still for hours at a stretch, uninterested in conversation, uninterested in anything at all. You watch it settle over parts of your own crew in exactly that pattern. A normally talkative topman named Cobb goes silent for the better part of 2 days, staring at nothing in particular, and when you finally ask if he's well, he tells you, in a flat voice that frightens you more than any fever talk would have, that he simply doesn't feel much like anything anymore. This is the register of dread that scurvy occupies that no cutlass wound or fever ever quite matches, not sudden, not violent, but a slow, patient unmaking of a person from the inside, one that a crew watching it happen has almost no tools to fight, and no real way of predicting how it ends. There's no enemy to fight back against, no wound to bandage, no clear moment where things visibly turn from bad to worse that anyone could point to and say, there, that's when it happened. Just a gradual, accumulating absence, day after day, of the person who used to stand at that exact spot on deck and talk too much during the evening meal. Here's the thing about a ship full of desperate, half-informed men facing a disease nobody fully understands. They try everything, and most of what they try does nothing at all. The ship's cook doses the worst affected men with extra vinegar, on the theory that anything sharp and unpleasant tasting must be doing some kind of medicinal work. Someone suggests wort of malt, a thin, bitter brewer's liquid occasionally recommended by physicians of the period as an anti-scorbutic, and the crew brews up what little they can manage from stores never intended for the purpose. None of it meaningfully helps, though nobody aboard has any reliable way of knowing that, because the ship has no control group, no comparison, nothing but a collection of desperate men trying every remedy that folk memory or a half-remembered physician's pamphlet has ever suggested to them. What actually would help, citrus fruit, in any meaningful quantity, simply isn't available, and won't be until the ship makes landfall or crosses paths with a trading vessel willing to sell fresh provisions. In the meantime, the crew does what desperate crews throughout this entire era did. They guess, they hope, and they watch their sickest men get worse regardless of the guessing. Someone else swears by a spoonful of gunpowder stirred into rum, an old sailor's remedy with no basis whatsoever in anything resembling medicine, offered with the same earnest confidence Josiah Teague once brought to his onion physic a few chapters back. It's worth remembering in moments like this that the men trying these remedies weren't fools. They were simply doing the only thing available to frightened people facing a problem no one around them could actually solve, reaching for anything that had ever, even once, seemed to help somebody they'd known. Whether a crew suffered badly from scurvy or largely avoided it, often came down to nothing more scientific than which captain they happened to sail under, and how much stock that particular man put in the accumulated folk wisdom of older sailors versus the formal medical theory of the day. Some captains, like Woodes Rogers on his own famous circumnavigation a few years before this voyage, stocked citrus whenever a port call allowed it, trusting decades of quiet sailors' observation over the more fashionable remedies favoured by university-trained physicians. Others followed the more conventional medical thinking of the period, doctoring their crews with vinegar, tar water. or dosages of mineral salts that did nothing measurable at all, and simply accepted the resulting losses as an unavoidable cost of long voyages, the same way they accepted storms or enemy fire. There was no pirate consensus on the matter, no shared rulebook beyond the individual judgment of whichever man happened to be standing on the quarterdeck giving orders. Your own captain falls, fortunately, into the first camp, a hard, pragmatic man who has buried enough crewmen over the years to have developed a stubborn, unscientific faith in citrus that he cannot begin to explain, but refuses to abandon. It's the kind of small, unglamorous decision that never makes it into any dramatic account of piracy, the sort of thing no ballad gets written about. But it is, in the most literal sense available, the difference between a ship that loses 2 or 3 men to this disease over a long voyage and a ship that loses a dozen, and every man aboard who lives through this cruise owes at least part of that survival to a captain's stubborn, half-superstitious hunch, rather than to any doctor at all. By week 9, a passing trading sloop draws alongside for a cautious, wary exchange of news and goods, the kind of loose, informal contact between vessels of uncertain reputation that happened constantly throughout the Caribbean and along the American coast, captains and crews trading rumours and provisions without asking too many pointed questions about each other's business. The sloop's captain, once satisfied your ship means him no immediate harm, relays grim news second-hand. Another vessel out of Jamaica, 3 weeks further into a similar voyage than yours, has lost 11 men to what he describes only as the sickness. Men too weak to work, too weak eventually to eat, who simply faded over a period of days once the disease had run far enough. 11 men is a number that lands hard on your own crew, murmured below decks for the rest of the evening in the particular hushed, superstitious tone sailors reserved for a fate that could easily have been theirs. It's the kind of second-hand news that never makes it into any official record. No ship's log from the doomed Jamaica vessel survives to confirm the exact count. And the trading captain who brought word of it may well have exaggerated the number in the retelling, the way news always grew a little in the passing from ship to ship. But it moves through the loose, informal network of vessels and traders exactly the way real information always did in this era. And it lands, for your crew, considerably harder than any abstract warning ever could. Someone asks the trading captain, half joking and half not, whether he's carrying any citrus aboard his own sloop. He isn't, not this trip, and the disappointment on deck is immediate and entirely unfeigned. By week 11, your ship finally makes for a small trading post on a Caribbean island the crew has visited before. And the relief that floods the deck the moment fresh provisions come aboard is almost physical in its intensity. Crates of oranges. A sack of limes, sharp and startling after 2.5 months of nothing but salt and biscuit. The crew falls on the fruit with something close to reverence, and Anders Voss, gums still tender, still working loose at one back tooth, eats his share slowly and carefully, savouring it in a way that makes you understand, for the first time, just how much he's been quietly enduring without complaint. Nobody aboard understands the actual mechanism at work. The controlled trial that would finally prove citrus as a cure, conducted by the naval physician James Lind aboard Salisbury, is still decades away, in 1747. And even after Lind's results were published, the Royal Navy would take another half-century to adopt citrus juice as standard issue for its own crews. For now, in this moment, the crew simply eats the fruit, because sailors have quietly known, for generations, that it helps, even without a shred of formal science behind the knowing. Within days, Voss's gums show the first real improvement anyone aboard has seen in 2 months. By week 13, back at sea and provisioned as well as a pirate ship can manage, Anders Voss is unmistakably recovering. The reopened scar on his forearm has begun, slowly to knit itself shut again, the raw edges finally closing over as his body, fed at last on something more than salt and biscuit, remembers how to repair itself. The loose tooth never fully reseats itself, and he'll carry a slight permanent gap in his smile for the rest of his life as the disease's one lasting signature on him, a small, visible reminder, worn without much self-consciousness, of a voyage that came closer to quietly unmaking him than any battle ever had. He tells you one evening on watch not long after that he's seen 3 separate crews lose men to the exact same slow decline over the course of his years at sea, and that this is the first time he's watched a man, himself in this case, come back from it rather than simply fade the way the others had. There's a particular kind of relief in that admission that's worth sitting with, because it's not the loud, celebratory relief of surviving a battle or escaping a pursuing warship. It's quieter than that, and in its own way more profound, the relief of a man who has watched this exact disease claim better sailors than himself, admitting, almost shyly, that this time it didn't claim him. You notice he says it to you specifically, rather than to the crew at large, and you understand, without either of you needing to say so directly, that the months you spent watching his gums bleed and his old scar weep have made you something like a witness to a private victory he isn't quite ready to celebrate too loudly, in case the disease is only resting rather than truly beaten. That's the strange, mixed inheritance scurvy leaves behind on a ship like this one. No glory, no dramatic story worth boasting about in port. Nothing that fits neatly alongside tales of boarding actions and captured treasure. Just a slow, patient, largely invisible war fought below decks against an enemy nobody aboard could properly name. Won or lost almost entirely by accident, decades before anyone in a London laboratory would finally figure out why the oranges worked at all, and even longer still before any navy on Earth would think to make that knowledge standard practice rather than one stubborn captain's private hunch. Voss lived to feel the gap in his own smile for the rest of his days. Not every story in this history ends with even that much mercy, and the next one belongs to an entire settlement, several thousand people strong, that gambled everything on cleaning up piracy for good and very nearly lost the wager to a disease no cutlass, no royal pardon, and no governor's authority could touch. Nassau, in the summer of 1718, was less a town than a rumour with buildings attached to it. For nearly 2 decades, the settlement on New Providence Island in the Bahamas had drifted without any real colonial government at all, passed between ineffective proprietary governors who did little to develop the islands, and in the years just before 1718 it had been claimed, almost entirely, by a loose confederation of pirate captains who called themselves the Flying Gang. Roughly 1,000 pirates made up the overwhelming majority of the island's population by this point, trading captured goods openly in the harbour, drinking through whatever plunder hadn't already been spent, and answering to no authority beyond whichever captain currently held the most influence among them. It was, by any honest account, the closest thing the Golden Age of Piracy had to a genuine capital city, a place where a man on the run from the law in Boston or Bristol could reasonably expect to find shelter, drink, and, if he wanted it, a berth aboard the next ship heading out on the account. Into this arrangement, on the 24th of July 1718, sailed a small convoy of British ships carrying a man named Woodes Rogers, the very same sea captain who a few years earlier had led the privateering voyage that made Thomas Dover rich and rescued Alexander Selkirk from 4 years of solitude on a Pacific island. Rogers arrived this time in an entirely different capacity, newly appointed by the Crown as the first royal governor of the Bahamas, carrying with him a formal pardon from King George I for any pirate willing to give up the trade and swear loyalty to the king. It was, on paper, a remarkably generous offer and a considerable gamble on the Crown's part, an entire colonial project staked on the hope that 1,000 hardened sea robbers would rather farm than plunder, if given half a genuine chance to do so. Whether Nassau's pirates would actually take it remained, as Rogers' ships approached the harbour, very much an open question. The pirates were not entirely surprised by his arrival. Word of the Crown's intentions had reached the island weeks earlier, discovered among the papers of a captured merchant vessel, and the assembled pirate captains had already argued the matter out among themselves, late into the night by some accounts, before Rogers ever dropped anchor. Most, weighing a genuine pardon against the steadily tightening noose of Royal Navy patrols, decided to accept. A defiant minority did not. Captain Charles Vane, commanding the fast sloop Ranger and unwilling to answer to any governor but himself, staged one of the more theatrical departures in the entire history of piracy. As Rogers' ships entered the harbour, Vane sent a captured fireship drifting toward them, forcing the governor's convoy to scatter and clear a path, then fired his own cannons at Rogers as he sailed past in open contempt before vanishing over the horizon in his considerably faster vessel. It was a bold, almost gleeful piece of theatre, and it cost Vane nothing in the moment, though the noose that had been tightening around Nassau's pirates would eventually catch up with him regardless, just not on this particular afternoon. Rogers, for his part, simply took the insult, took the harbour, and got to work, unwilling to let a single sloop's worth of theatre delay a project he'd crossed an ocean to begin. There was, as it turned out, an enormous amount of work waiting for him, considerably more than even a man of his considerable experience at sea had likely anticipated, and considerably less time to accomplish it than he could have known that first afternoon. What Rogers found on shore, once the initial spectacle of his arrival had settled, was closer to ruin than to a functioning settlement. The fort that was meant to defend the harbour stood in near total disrepair, its walls crumbling under years of neglect, most of its cannon unusable or missing entirely. The town's buildings were dilapidated, its roads overgrown, its general condition, by Rogers' own later account, filthy almost past description. And the military force he had at his actual disposal to defend and govern this fragile new colony amounted to little more than 100 to 150 men, many of them not soldiers in any meaningful fighting sense at all, but out-pensioners of London's Chelsea Hospital, a home for aged, injured and otherwise unfit veterans, sent to the Caribbean to serve as a garrison because London had, quite simply, nothing better to spare for the job. Rogers was governing a former pirate capital, home to hundreds of hardened former sea robbers who had only just agreed to lay down their weapons, with a defence force largely composed of elderly and disabled ex-soldiers who under ordinary circumstances would have been considered unfit for active duty of any kind. It was, from the very first week, a governorship built on almost nothing but Rogers's own stubbornness and the thin promise of reinforcements from London that would arrive, if they arrived at all, agonisingly late and desperately short of what the situation actually required. Rogers had, in effect, been handed a kingdom in ruins and asked to defend it with a garrison better suited to a veteran's almshouse than a colonial frontier, and he seems to have understood the absurdity of his own position clearly enough, even as he set about the work anyway, with the same practical stubbornness that had once led him to trust a crate of limes over his own ship's physician. The threat that ultimately did the most damage to Rogers' fragile new colony, though, came from neither the pirates who'd stayed to test his authority, nor the Spanish forces watching from Cuba with their own designs on the island. It came from mosquitoes, foul water, and the tropical diseases that had always haunted Caribbean settlements, and that no governor, however capable, had any real tools to fight. By November of 1718, a mere 4 months after Rogers' arrival, tropical disease, very likely yellow fever compounded by malaria and dysentery, had carried off almost half of the colony's settlers, and had claimed, in an especially devastating and specific blow to the colony's long-term prospects, essentially all of its skilled labourers, the carpenters, the masons, the men with the actual trade knowledge needed to rebuild a fort or raise a proper building, gone within a single punishing season. Half, it bears repeating plainly, without softening, within 4 months of Rogers's arrival, roughly half the people he had brought to build a lawful functioning colony out of a pirate haven were dead, and the survivors were left to rebuild a fort and a government with barely half the hands they'd started with. No pitched battle in the entire Golden Age of Piracy, not even the bloodiest engagement recorded at Cape Coast Castle or off Cape Lopez, came close to inflicting that kind of loss in that short a span of time. Disease did it quietly, over a single rainy season, while the world's attention remained fixed on pirates and Spanish warships, on royal pardons and captured treasure, on every part of this story, in other words, except the part that was actually killing the most people. There is no surviving list of names for most of the settlers lost that season, no memorial, no ship's log with a tally kept in a captain's careful hand the way a naval vessel might have recorded its own losses. They were farmers, labourers, tradesmen, and their families arrived with Rogers to build something permanent out of a lawless harbour, and they mostly disappear from the record exactly the way so many of the forced pirates and powder monkeys elsewhere in this story do, present in the aggregate count, absent from anything resembling an individual story. It's worth pausing on that absence deliberately, rather than letting the number alone carry the weight. Because a number this large is easy to read past without actually feeling it, half of everyone who sailed into that harbour with Rogers in July did not live to see the following spring. Rogers' own letters from this period, preserved and later quoted by historians studying the colony, capture something of the exhaustion and frustration of trying to govern under these conditions. The tone of a genuinely capable man watching circumstances outrun every solution he could bring to bear on them. Of the pirates who had taken his pardon and were meant to be settling into productive island life as farmers and labourers, he complained bitterly of their reluctance to take up the toilsome, unglamorous work of actual agriculture, work that offered nothing like the quick, dramatic rewards of a captured prize. Nearly half of them, by his own account, simply absconded rather than commit to the slow, uncertain labour of building a farm from nothing. A decision Rogers admitted with visible weariness he could hardly find it in himself to argue against, since he privately doubted most of them were suited to becoming land improvers in the first place. It's a small, telling admission from a man otherwise committed to the entire project of reforming Nassau's pirates into lawful citizens, even its architect suspected, by that first terrible winter, that some of what he'd promised the crown might simply be impossible. Meanwhile, the survivors of the epidemic, pirates, pardoned and unpardoned alike alongside the colony's remaining ordinary settlers, nursed each other through fevers with exactly the same limited folk remedy toolkit this entire story has followed from ship to ship, rest, fluids, whatever fresh food could be found, and hope. There was no more real medicine ashore in Nassau, for all its status as a proper crown colony now, than there had ever been aboard any of the pirate ships that once called its harbour home. Disease was not, unfortunately, the only threat Rogers had to manage that first difficult winter. In December of 1718, even as the colony continued to bury its dead, Rogers convened a formal Vice-Admiralty court, 7 commissioners meeting in the governor's own guardroom, to try 10 men accused of returning to piracy despite having accepted the king's pardon. All 10 pleaded not guilty, in the face of what the record describes as overwhelming evidence against them. 9 were convicted and sentenced to hang. One man, John Hips, was granted a reprieve after successfully convincing the court he had only sailed with the pirates under duress, in a fashion the reader of this story will, by now, recognise as a familiar and well-worn defence. It was a stark, deliberate demonstration of the new order Rogers intended to enforce, law and consequence, publicly and visibly applied, even as the graveyard filling up on the same island told a very different story about which force, disease or the gallows, was actually claiming more lives that season. Rogers proved shrewd enough, even amid the chaos of that first year, to recognise that reformed pirates possessed something no amount of Royal Navy muscle could easily replace: intimate, first-hand knowledge of pirate havens, hideouts, and the habits of captains still at large. He made use of that knowledge wherever he could find it, employing at least one former pirate's own husband as a paid informant against his wife's old associates, James Bonney, whose wife Anne had by then abandoned him entirely to join the crew of the pirate captain, John Rackham, known widely as Calico Jack, sailing alongside a second woman, Mary Read, in one of the most unusual partnerships the entire Golden Age of Piracy produced. Rogers issued a warrant for Rackham's crew in September of 1719, though in the end it was a ship sent by the governor of Jamaica, rather than any force of Rogers' own, that finally ran the pirates down and captured Bonney, Read and Rackham together the following year. It's a small, almost gossipy footnote to the larger story of Rogers' governorship, but it captures something true about how thin and improvised his actual authority really was in those first uncertain years. A colony rebuilding itself from a fever epidemic, governed by a man forced to rely on estranged husbands and second-hand tips just to keep track of the pirates he was nominally supposed to have already driven out. The following year brought Rogers no real reprieve. In February of 1720, a Spanish fleet of some 1,200 troops and sailors, dispatched from Havana as part of a broader war between Spain and Britain, descended on Nassau intending to dislodge the fragile British colony once and for all. Rogers, drawing on a defence force that still consisted largely of former pirates, ordinary settlers, and enslaved men who rallied to help defend the fort rather than any proper garrison, held the harbour through several days of bombardment and failed landings, inflicting heavy losses on the Spanish before they finally withdrew empty-handed. It was, by any fair measure, a genuine military triumph for a governor with almost nothing left to fight with, and it came only a little more than a year after the same colony had buried half its population to fever, a juxtaposition that captures, better than almost anything else in this story, just how many different and unrelated ways this era found to kill people who had already survived so much simply to get there. By 1719, Rogers had genuinely succeeded in driving most of Nassau's remaining pirates out of the region entirely, breaking the back of the flying gang's hold on the island for good. It should have been an unambiguous triumph. Instead, it arrived alongside continued Spanish threats, at least one plot against Rogers's own life uncovered and punished with public flogging, and a colony still reeling, financially and physically, from the epidemic that had gutted it the previous winter. Rogers' triumph over piracy, in the end, cost him almost everything else. The expenses of governing, feeding a struggling colony, maintaining the Delicia, a 40-gun guardship he and his private backers, funded largely out of their own pockets, because London's support never fully materialised in either money or manpower, and simply keeping Nassau from collapsing entirely during a period when its labour force had been effectively halved by disease, drove Rogers into serious mounting debt that no governor's salary could hope to outpace. He had, in effect, been left to personally underwrite the defence of an entire British colony, using a fortune built on privateering plunder a decade earlier, while the Crown that had appointed him offered encouragement and official pardons, but precious little actual funding. When his original financial backers eventually sued him, alleging they'd never received their fair share of the colony's profits, Rogers was forced into bankruptcy, and by 1721, the man who had rescued Alexander Selkirk, made Thomas Dover rich, and driven the pirates out of their own capital city, found himself imprisoned for debt back in England, a genuinely bitter homecoming for a man who had, by nearly every practical measure, accomplished exactly what the Crown had asked of him, at a cost the Crown itself never fully repaid. He would not stay down for good. In 1728, after years spent working to restore both his finances and his reputation, Rogers was appointed governor of the Bahamas for a second term, returning to the same island where he'd buried so many of his original settlers a decade earlier. He died in Nassau on the 15th of July 1732 and was buried there, the founder of a colony that had cost him his fortune, his health, and very nearly his life, laid to rest in the same soil that had claimed so many of the people he'd brought there to build it. Here is the accounting that rarely makes it into the popular telling of how the Golden Age of Piracy came to an end. Woodes Rogers is remembered, and rightly, as the governor who broke Nassau's status as a pirate republic, who offered a genuine and largely honoured pardon, who turned a lawless harbour into a functioning, if fragile, British colony. He is remembered far less often as a man who, in doing so, watched roughly half the population he brought with him die within a single season to a disease that no pardon, no fort, and no display of royal authority could touch. The pirates Rogers came to defeat killed comparatively few of his people directly. The mosquitoes killed nearly half of them within 4 months, and did it so quietly and so far from any battlefield anyone thought to commemorate that the loss barely registers in most retellings of this story at all. It's worth asking, honestly, what Rogers himself would have made of that imbalance in how his legacy is remembered. He spent a fortune, and very nearly his own life, fighting pirates whose names still fill books and films 3 centuries later, vain, Rackham, Bonney, Reed, while the epidemic that killed several times more of his own people than any of those pirates ever did remains, even now. A footnote most tellings of his story skip entirely. That's not a failure of Roger's own record-keeping. It's simply the pattern this entire history keeps returning to. Violence makes for a better story than fever does, even when the fever did far more of the actual killing. That's the through line this entire history keeps circling back to. In port after port, ship after ship, for every pirate who died on a gallows or in a boarding action, there was very likely another who died, or nearly died, of something no cutlass could touch and no doctor aboard could name. And the men and women who built and unbuilt the pirate world of the early 18th century knew that risk as intimately as they knew the risk of the noose. Somewhere in that same uneasy world, though, one man had already spent years learning exactly how deep that particular danger could run, because he'd lived through it firsthand, as a barber surgeon serving under one of the most notorious captains of the entire buccaneering era, and had written it all down before anyone else thought the story worth telling. A barber surgeon's written account of his own years among the buccaneers is where this story is ultimately headed, but not yet. First, there's a piece of paper this whole history has mentioned again and again without ever fully unfolding, the actual document that promised you, and every man like you, something for the risk you were taking. It's time to see what happens when that promise gets called in. The pain arrives before the sound does, which is somehow worse. A white total absence where your right hand used to be, and only after it that the actual crack of the swivel gun reaches you. A half-second delay that your mind will replay for the rest of your life without ever quite making sense of the order events happened in. You're on your back on the deck before you've even registered falling. Gulls wheeling overhead against a sky that seems, absurdly, no different than it did a minute earlier. And the first thing you actually see clearly, once your vision settles, is Rhys Bevan crouched over you, his own face gone pale and still, pressing a wadded strip of canvas hard against what's left of your wrist. Bevan is the ship's sailmaker, a Welshman who's been aboard longer than almost anyone else in this particular crew, and it is entirely by chance rather than any special training that he's the one kneeling over you now. He simply happened to be nearest when the recoiling gun took your hand clean off at the wrist. A hazard of working the smaller swivel guns that everyone aboard knows about and nobody discusses much, the way sailors avoid discussing any danger too routine and too likely to happen to them personally. He's pressing hard enough that it hurts in a way that almost cuts through the shock, and he's talking to you the entire time in a low, steady voice that has nothing comforting in its actual words, and everything comforting in its simple, unbroken presence. Hold still now. Hold still. You'll live, you'll live. Somewhere behind him you're dimly aware of the fight still going on, muskets and shouting, but it has already receded into something distant and unimportant, the way the whole world does when your body is busy deciding whether it's going to survive the next several minutes. What strikes you most, in the disorienting hours that follow carried below, the stump wrapped and bound as tightly as the ship's limited stores allow, given rum in a quantity that would alarm you on any ordinary day, isn't the pain, though there's plenty of that, radiating up your arm in waves that come and go with your own heartbeat. It's the absence of anything resembling panic or despair among the men looking after you. Nobody treats your injury as a tragedy in the way you might expect, the kind of hushed, mournful attention a village might pay to a similarly maimed neighbour. Instead, the quartermaster himself comes below within the hour, not to offer sympathy exactly, but to confirm, in a brisk and businesslike tone, that your injury will be recorded, and that you'll receive what you're owed once the ship reaches port, and the common stock can be properly settled. This isn't coldness, whatever it might look like from the outside. It's the ship's articles doing precisely the job they were written to do, the same written constitution every man aboard signed, under one degree of willingness or another, before this cruise ever began. Buried among the rules about lights out and gambling and the treatment of captured women, most sets of pirate articles from this era included a clause addressing exactly your situation, in language blunt enough to leave no real room for dispute. You'd heard the article read aloud, along with all the others, on the day you signed, everyone had. But hearing a number spoken aloud in the abstract, and having that number applied directly to your own newly missing hand, turn out to be two very different experiences entirely. None of this existed in isolation from the rest of how a pirate ship actually governed itself. And it's worth understanding the wider system the compensation clause sat inside, because the two reinforced each other in ways that mattered enormously to a man in your position, lying below with a stump for a hand and a promise on paper that was about to be tested against reality. The captain of a pirate ship, unlike his naval or merchant counterpart, held near absolute authority only in the heat of an actual engagement. At every other moment, his position depended on a vote, and could be ended by one, if the crew judged him cowardly, cruel, or simply incompetent. The quartermaster, elected separately and answering just as directly to the crew's collective judgment, held the keys to the common stock, settled disputes over plunder, and administered most day-to-day punishments, functioning as a genuine check on the captain's power, rather than a subordinate who simply carried out his orders. It was, by the standards of virtually any other institution afloat in the early 18th century, an extraordinary degree of collective say for ordinary working men to hold over their own fate. That structure is precisely what gave the compensation article its teeth. A promise written into a document that any man could vote to enforce, made to a crew that could remove a captain who broke faith with it, carried a weight that a similar promise from a distant, unaccountable naval bureaucracy simply couldn't match. You didn't have to trust your captain's personal decency to believe you'd be paid for your hand. You had to trust a system that every man aboard, including you, had a genuine vote in, and that distinction, more than any individual captain's character, is what made the promise real rather than merely comforting. The specific numbers varied a little from ship to ship, captain to captain, but the shape of the promise stayed remarkably consistent across nearly every surviving set of pirate articles from the era. Captain Bartholomew Roberts' code, preserved through the later trial records of his crew, promised 800 pieces of 8 to any man who lost a limb or became a cripple in the ship's service, with lesser sums scaled down proportionately for lesser injuries. A joint rather than a whole limb, a hand rather than an entire arm. Captain John Phillips' articles, the very same ship's code this story has already followed once, specified the arrangement in nearly identical terms: 400 pieces of 8 for a joint, 800 for a full limb. Captains Edward Lowe and George Lowther, sailing together for a stretch in 1722, offered their own crews a slightly different sum, but the same basic guarantee. This wasn't a single captain's personal generosity. It was, across an entire generation of pirate captains operating independently of one another, treated as simple common sense, the accepted cost of doing business in a trade that ran on violence. Paid out of a common fund every man aboard had a direct stake in keeping honest. For you, lying below with your wrist wrapped and throbbing, that means a specific number, 400 pieces of 8, the sum this ship's own article set aside for the loss of a hand rather than a full arm. It is, by any standard available to a working sailor in 1720, a genuinely significant sum of money, more than most merchant seamen could hope to earn across several full years of honest, exhausting labour. The 400 pieces of 8 owed for your hand sat within a broader, more detailed scale than most casual retellings of pirate life ever bother to mention, a schedule of compensation more thorough than many ordinary sailors of the period ever encountered in their entire working lives. Surviving articles from several captains extended the same logic well beyond simple limbs and joints, compensation scaled for the loss of an eye, for severe disfigurement, for injuries that left a man unable to work his trade even without costing him a visible body part outright. The underlying principle, consistent across nearly every surviving example, was that a man's future earning capacity, not merely the drama of his wound, was what the common stock existed to protect. A blinded gunner and a one-handed sailmaker were both, in the eyes of the articles, men whose livelihood had been taken from them in the ship's service. and both were owed something concrete in return, rather than simply being left to beg or starve once the voyage ended. What the articles conspicuously did not cover, in almost every surviving example historians have studied, was death itself. There was no widow's payment, no lump sum set aside for whatever family a killed pirate might have left behind on land. A silence that says something quietly devastating about how this entire trade regarded its own worst outcome. An injury, however severe, was treated as a cost of doing business, worth negotiating for and writing into a contract in advance. Death was simply death, absorbed into the general risk everyone aboard had already accepted the moment they signed their name, with nothing further to be said about it once a man was gone. It's a hard, unsentimental logic, and one worth sitting with honestly rather than smoothing over. The articles protected the living from becoming destitute. They offered nothing at all to anyone the dead might have left behind. By the time your wound has scarred over, some 6 weeks later, you've watched the machinery of this promise work itself out in careful, almost bureaucratic detail. And it's worth understanding exactly how deliberate that process actually was, because it cuts hard against the image of piracy as pure chaos, with no real structure underneath it. The quartermaster keeps a running written account of the ship's plunder, held in common until the crew reaches port or the value promised in the articles, often a set target, £1,000 a man on some ships, before anyone can even discuss disbanding the voyage. Your claim, and Bevan's own claim from an injury sustained on an earlier voyage entirely, are recorded against that common stock, the same way a debt or a share of prize money would be recorded, awaiting formal settlement. Rhys Bevan, it turns out, has his own history with exactly this system, and watching you go through the process for the first time seems to stir something in him he doesn't often talk about. 3 years earlier, on a different ship entirely, he lost 2 fingers on his left hand to a badly frayed line that snapped under tension during a storm. A genuine accident, no enemy involved at all. But one the articles of that earlier ship covered anyway, treating a storm's cruelty as no less deserving of compensation than an enemy's. He was paid a partial sum, scaled down for the lesser injury exactly as the articles promised, and he tells you, with a dry, private kind of pride, that he still has the coins from that payout tucked away, untouched, because spending them has always felt like spending some tangible proof that the promise, once, was actually kept. He doesn't say so directly, but you get the sense, listening to him, that those particular coins matter to him less as money and more as evidence, proof kept close. That the men he sails with are capable of honouring their own word even when nothing beyond their own conscience and a captain's willingness would ever force them to. It's worth pausing here to set this system against the alternative available to an ordinary sailor of the period who wasn't sailing under the black flag, because the contrast says a great deal about why so many men chose piracy in the first place, whatever the risk of the noose that came attached to it. The Royal Navy maintained its own fund for exactly this purpose, known as the Chatham Chest, established as far back as 1588 to provide for sailors wounded or maimed in service to the Crown. In theory, it worked on the same basic principle as a pirate ship's common stock, money paid in, set aside, and distributed to men who'd earned it through injury. In practice, by the early 18th century, the Chatham Chest had become notorious among sailors for exactly the opposite reputation. Chronically mismanaged, drained faster than it was replenished, and painfully slow to pay out even the modest sums it did eventually offer, when it offered anything at all. A naval sailor who lost a hand in the King's service might wait years for a payment that arrived, if it arrived, diminished and grudging. A pirate who lost a hand under Roberts's or Phillips' articles, by grim contrast, could expect a specific number, agreed upon in advance by vote, paid out of a fund every man aboard had watched being counted with his own eyes, settled within weeks of making port, rather than years of petitioning a distant naval bureaucracy that had every incentive to delay. It is one of the era's genuine, almost uncomfortable ironies. The outlaws kept better books, and kept their word more reliably, than the Crown they were nominally at war with, a fact that surely wasn't lost on the many pirates, Rhys Bevan almost certainly among them, who had first gone to sea as ordinary merchant or naval sailors and experienced the more official version of this same broken promise first-hand, long before ever signing a pirate's articles at all. None of which is to say the pirate system was flawless, and this story would do Rhys Bevan and every man like him a disservice by pretending otherwise. The common stock could run dry, particularly late in an unlucky voyage that hadn't taken the prizes a crew had hoped for, and a captain determined to renege on the articles entirely, rare but not unheard of, had very little standing between himself and a crew too battered, too small, or too intimidated to force the issue. Disputes over exactly how an injury should be classified, a joint against a full limb, a temporary wound against a permanent one, occasionally turned bitter enough to require the captain's own judgment to settle, and a captain's judgment, unlike the plain wording of the articles themselves, wasn't always as impartial as the system pretended it to be. The promise was real. It was not, in every single case, perfectly kept. But it was kept far more often than not, and kept specifically because the men who stood to benefit from it had also voted it into existence themselves, had watched the common stock counted honestly in front of them, and retained, at least in principle, the power to depose a captain who broke faith with the very document he'd signed alongside everyone else. That accountability, however imperfect in practice, was something an ordinary naval or merchant sailor of the same era simply didn't have any comparable version of at all. 6 weeks after your injury, the ship finally makes port, and you stand before the quartermaster in the same brisk, business-like exchange Bevan described to you weeks earlier. No ceremony, no speech, just a careful counting out of 400 pieces of 8 from the ship's common stock, tallied against the article that named your exact injury months before you'd ever imagined needing it. It is, by a wide margin, the most money you have ever held in your life at one time, and you find yourself, like Davy Hollis in an earlier chapter of this same story, counting it more than once, as though a second count might somehow make the sum feel more real than the missing weight at the end of your right arm already has. Bevan is there for the counting, standing a little apart, watching with the particular quiet satisfaction of a man who has been exactly where you're standing now and knows precisely what it means. He doesn't say much. He doesn't need to. When the counting finishes, he simply claps you once, carefully on your good shoulder, and tells you, in the same low, steady voice he used the day the swivel gun took your hand, that you'll manage fine from here. You believe him, mostly because you watched him manage fine himself, 3 fingers lighter and several years further down this same hard road. There's a genuine tenderness in this whole strange, business-like ritual that's easy to miss if you're only looking for it in the obvious places, in speeches, in ceremony, in the kind of visible warmth a village might show an injured neighbour. It isn't there. What's there instead is something narrower and, in its own quiet way, more remarkable. A document, written and voted on by desperate, often coerced men with every reason to distrust one another, but nonetheless held up, article by article, exactly when it mattered most. A quartermaster who counted your coins honestly in front of witnesses, because the system depended on his doing so. A sailmaker who remembered his own payout well enough, years later, to stand beside you for yours. Pirates get remembered, correctly, for violence, for theft, for a genuine and considerable body count spread across the entire Golden Age. They get remembered far less often for this, for building, entirely from necessity and without any king or parliament to answer to, one of the more reliable systems of occupational compensation available anywhere in the early 18th century world. A promise made among men who had almost nothing else to trust each other with, and who mostly, against every reasonable expectation, kept it anyway. It is a strange kind of legacy for a trade defined, in the popular imagination, almost entirely by its lawlessness, that some of its most lawless practitioners wrote down, in plain language every man could understand and vote to enforce. A fairer accounting of what a body was owed for its risk than most of their lawful counterparts back on land ever managed. The man who eventually wrote the fullest surviving account of exactly this kind of buccaneer life, articles and amputations and all, never set foot on a ship like Roberts or Phillips. He served a full generation earlier, under a captain whose name still overshadows nearly every other figure in this entire story. And what he wrote down afterward, almost by accident, in a foreign language for readers who had never seen a pirate ship in their lives, became the foundation nearly everything historians now know about pirate medicine still rests upon. Everything this story has traced so far, the cooks and carpenters standing in for surgeons, the articles promising payment for a lost hand, the slow private war fought against scurvy below decks, survives today largely because people who lived through it eventually wrote it down. Only a small handful of those accounts were written by someone who had actually held the knife himself. This is the story of the man who held it. Honfleur, in the French province of Normandy, is the most likely birthplace of a boy born around 1645, whose own origins remain, even now, a matter of genuine scholarly dispute. Historians have argued for generations over whether Alexandre Olivier Exquemelin was French, Dutch or Flemish by birth. A question complicated by the various languages his own name has been rendered in across different editions of his work, and one his own surviving writing never quite settles either way. What isn't in dispute is what happened to him in 1666. At around the age of 21, he was engaged, or more accurately sold into a period of indentured service, by the French West India Company, and shipped across the Atlantic to the island of Tortuga, a rocky outcrop off the northern coast of Hispaniola that had become, by this point in the 17th century, one of the Caribbean's principal havens for the loosely organised bands of pirates, hunters and outcasts, known collectively as buccaneers, men drawn from half a dozen nations and united by little beyond a shared unwillingness to go home. His 3 years of bonded service were, by his own later account, close to unbearable, the ordinary hardships of indentured labour compounded by a tropical climate, and a master with little apparent interest in his servant's well-being beyond the labour that servant could still perform. He belonged, for a period, to the island's deputy governor, a man who treated him with a harshness severe enough that Exquemelin would later describe conditions barely distinguishable from slavery, despite the legal fiction of an eventual release once his term of service and accumulated debts were paid. He had, by any measure available to a young man in his position, nothing, no money, no family within reach, no clear path forward beyond simply surviving whatever his master demanded of him next. What changed his fortunes, in a turn of events that would end up shaping the entire rest of his life, was his own body failing him. Exquemelin fell seriously ill at some point during his indenture. The exact nature of the sickness isn't recorded, though tropical fever of one kind or another would have been the likeliest culprit for any European recently arrived in the Caribbean, and in a decision driven as much by his master's unwillingness to keep nursing a sick and unproductive servant as by any real generosity, he was sold onward to a surgeon on the island. It was, against every reasonable expectation, the best thing that had happened to him since leaving France. The surgeon treated him with genuine care, nursing him back to health over the better part of a full year, and then did something Exquemelin's original master never once considered. He offered the young man his freedom outright, on the informal condition that Exquemelin would repay the cost of his own care once he'd earned enough money to do so honestly. It's worth pausing on the quiet decency buried in that arrangement, easy to skip past in a story that will shortly turn to raids and plunder. A man with every legal right to simply keep a bonded servant chose instead to heal him and let him go, trusting a stranger's word about a debt that had no real legal mechanism forcing him to honour it at all. In the process, whether he intended it or not, the surgeon also taught Exquemelin something of his own trade, the practical, hands-on medical knowledge of a working island surgeon in the 1660s Caribbean, knowledge that was about to become the young Frenchman's only real asset in the world. Freed but still owing a debt he had no ordinary way to repay, Exquemelin made the same calculation that would draw thousands of desperate, dispossessed men to the same trade throughout this entire era. Buccaneering offered a faster route to real money than any legitimate trade available to a penniless former indentured servant on a Caribbean island. However steep the accompanying risk to life and limb, he joined the buccaneers, almost certainly serving in the specific and valuable capacity of barber surgeon, a role that combined, in the loose medical practice of the 17th century, the duties of a surgeon with the more mundane trade of a barber, since the two professions shared many of the same basic tools and were rarely formally separated outside major European cities. Exquemelin's service brought him, eventually, into the orbit of the single most notorious buccaneer captain of the entire era, Henry Morgan, the Welsh privateer whose raids against Spanish colonial targets made him both feared across the Caribbean and, eventually, a knighted lieutenant governor of Jamaica in his own right. An almost unbelievable arc from freebooter to establishment authority within the span of a single working lifetime. Exquemelin sailed with Morgan's forces for several years, by most accounts serving close enough to the captain's own inner circle to later describe him as something like a confidante, close enough to observe both the calculated strategy and the casual brutality of Morgan's campaigns from a vantage point few outsiders ever earned. Buccaneer life, as Exquemelin came to document it in exacting, often startling detail, ran on customs and structures that would sound strange to a modern reader raised on more sanitized pirate mythology. Buccaneers commonly lived in tight-knit pairs called matelotage, sharing property, sharing risk, and, critically for a story about medicine at sea, caring for one another through sickness and injury with a devotion that went well beyond simple shipboard duty. A matelot nursed his partner through fever, dressed his wounds after a raid, and by Exquemelin's own account, the bond between such pairs frequently outlasted individual voyages and individual captains, becoming one of the few genuinely stable relationships available in an otherwise transient, violent world. It's a detail modern retellings of buccaneer history often skip past entirely, more comfortable with tales of plunder than with the quieter, more intimate structures of care buccaneers actually built to survive a life that offered almost nothing else in the way of stability. Exquemelin himself would have understood the value of that kind of bond better than most, given his own path into this world. A stranger's decision to nurse him back to health, rather than simply discard him, had been the single hinge on which his entire subsequent life turned. It isn't hard to imagine that experience shaping how closely he noticed, and how carefully he recorded, the small daily kindnesses buccaneer partners extended to one another. A trade built on plunder and violence, in other words, also quietly built, out of sheer necessity. Some of the most durable caretaking relationships available anywhere in the 17th century Atlantic world, and it took a former bonded servant turned surgeon to notice that contradiction was worth writing down at all. Exquemelin also recorded, with the clinical attention of a man who'd trained under an actual surgeon, the harder edges of that same world. The brutal and often improvised medical treatment following a raid, the makeshift amputations performed with whatever tools a landing party happened to be carrying, the grim calculus buccaneers applied to their own wounded when a raid demanded they move fast. And a badly injured man threatened to slow the entire company down. None of it was softened in the telling. Exquemelin wrote what he saw, including the parts that reflected poorly on the men he'd sailed alongside. The undisputed climax of Exquemelin's years among the buccaneers came in January of 1671, when Henry Morgan led a combined force of well over 1,000 men across the Isthmus of Panama to sack Panama City itself, one of the largest and most audacious operations of the entire buccaneering era, and one Exquemelin witnessed firsthand. The city, though wealthy, offered far less immediate plunder than the buccaneers had hoped for, much of its treasure evacuated or hidden before the attackers arrived, and what followed, by Exquemelin's own unflinching account, included widespread destruction, considerable cruelty toward prisoners suspected of hiding wealth, and a fire that reduced much of the city to ash under circumstances that remain disputed to this day. Spanish accounts blamed Morgan's men directly, while Morgan himself insisted the fire was set by the city's own defenders rather than his own forces. Exquemelin doesn't fully resolve that dispute in his own writing, and this account won't pretend to resolve it here either. since the truth likely sits somewhere in the genuinely contested space between both versions rather than cleanly on either side. What his account does provide, regardless of where the blame ultimately falls, is something no Spanish administrative report or Morgan's own self-serving testimony ever could. The perspective of a working buccaneer surgeon who marched across an isthmus, treated the wounded on both sides of an engagement most of Europe would only ever read about second-hand, and lived to write down what he'd actually witnessed, rather than what any single faction wanted remembered. The march itself, before the fighting even began, cost the expedition dearly, in ways no battle report from either side bothered to record. Men falling to exhaustion and fever-crossing dense jungle terrain with inadequate supplies, the same kind of quiet, unglamorous attrition that has shadowed nearly every crew and every voyage across this entire history. Exquemelin, treating those men as best a barber surgeon's training allowed, would have understood better than almost anyone else present that the isthmus itself, and not merely the eventual battle for the city, was doing at least as much damage to Morgan's force as any Spanish defender managed to inflict. Among the details Exquemelin recorded, almost in passing, amid his larger account of buccaneer campaigns, are descriptions of exactly the kind of improvised battlefield surgery this entire history has already followed once. More than 50 years before Thomas Fenn ever picked up his own carpenter's saw aboard John Phillips's Revenge. Buccaneer landing parties operating far from any ship and any semblance of a proper medical chest routinely handled their own wounded with whatever tools happened to be at hand, a hunting knife, a hatchet, whatever cloth could be spared for a dressing, and Exquemelin. Trained by an actual surgeon, even if never formally credentialed at the time, seems to have served as exactly the kind of improvising, self-taught medical hand this story has traced through cooks, carpenters, and quartermasters alike. The pattern wasn't new when Phillips lost his leg in 1724. It was already, by Exquemelin's own eyewitness account from the 1670s, the established, unremarkable norm of an entire trade, one generation of buccaneers and pirates after another, inheriting the same basic problem and solving it, imperfectly, the same basic way. It's a genuinely striking thing to realise, sitting with the full arc of this story, the makeshift medicine that opened this entire account, a carpenter's saw and a heated hatchet aboard a ship in 1724, wasn't some late-era desperation measure born of a dying trade running out of options. It was simply how things had always been done as far back as the written record reaches, and likely further still into the unrecorded decades before Exquemelin ever picked up a pen to describe it. By 1674, Exquemelin's years among the buccaneers had come to an end, and he made his way back across the Atlantic to Europe, eventually settling in Amsterdam. There, in a detail that carries its own quiet irony given everything this chapter has already described, he formally qualified as a surgeon in October of 1679, his name entered onto the official register of the Dutch Surgeons' Guild, years after he had already treated wounded men through some of the most violent campaigns of the entire buccaneering era, entirely without any formal credential to his name. The paper came after the practice, rather than before it. Exactly the pattern this entire story has traced from ship to ship, real medical skill, hard-won and genuinely useful, arriving years ahead of any institution's willingness to formally recognise it. It was in Amsterdam, drawing on the manuscript he'd apparently kept throughout his years at sea, that Exquemelin produced the work that would outlast every raid he'd ever taken part in, De Amerikanische Zeeroovers, published in Dutch in 1678, a first-hand account of buccaneer life, customs and campaigns that became, almost immediately, one of the most widely read and widely translated books of its era. German, Spanish, English and French editions followed within a handful of years, each one adapted, expanded, and in some cases considerably altered from Exquemelin's original text by translators eager to add their own embellishments to an already sensational story. Success brought its own complications. The book's frank, often unflattering portrait of Henry Morgan, by then a knighted colonial official rather than a freebooting captain, reportedly provoked Morgan himself into pursuing a slander action against the book's English publishers. A former buccaneer's own memoir turned into a genuine legal liability for the men who'd profited from printing it. Exquemelin, for his part, seems to have simply moved forward with his life regardless of the controversy his writing had stirred up an ocean away. He returned to sea more than once in the years that followed, serving as ship's surgeon during a Caribbean raid in 1683, and again at the very end of his documented career during a French assault on Cartagena in 1697. A working surgeon well into what would then have been considered old age, still treating the same kinds of wounds he'd first learned to treat as a bonded servant sold off by a master who no longer wanted him. He spent his final recorded years back in France, revising and expanding his own book with new material drawn from decades of accumulated experience. Work that would eventually become the basis for a substantially enlarged edition published in 1699. He is believed to have died sometime after 1707, in circumstances the historical record doesn't preserve with any certainty. A quiet, undocumented ending for a man whose own writing did more than perhaps any other single source to document an era that would otherwise have vanished into rumour and exaggeration. That legacy hasn't faded with time the way so much else about the buccaneering era has. Modern historians studying the Golden Age of Piracy still return to Exquemelin's account as one of the very few genuine eyewitness sources available from inside the buccaneer world itself, rather than from a distant court record, a captured pirate's coerced trial testimony, or a later writer like Charles Johnson working second-hand from other people's reports. Libraries and archives that preserve rare 17th century books still count early editions of his work among their most valuable holdings, and the book remains, more than 3 centuries after its first printing, required reading for anyone seriously studying how buccaneers actually lived, fought and cared for one another, rather than how later fiction imagined they did. It is not without its own flaws and exaggerations. Subsequent scholarship has identified places where later editions added material of dubious origin, embellishing Exquemelin's original account in exactly the sensationalized direction contemporary readers wanted, but the core of it, the part written by a man who had actually held the knife and dressed the wounds himself, has proven remarkably durable against 300 years of scrutiny. Here is what's genuinely remarkable about where this whole story ends up. Once you step back far enough to see the full shape of it, nearly everything modern historians and writers know about the daily, unglamorous reality of buccaneer and pirate medicine, the makeshift amputations, the Matelot bonds of care between shipmates, the grim improvisation of men with no formal training doing their honest best for the wounded and dying around them, traces back in some meaningful way to a single indentured servant's decision to write down what he'd witnessed, in a language most of his own former shipmates couldn't even read. Every carpenter's saw, every cook's onion physic, every quartermaster's honestly counted payout this story has followed across 7 chapters exists in the historical record, largely because people like Exquemelin and the trial witnesses who testified against men like Peter Scudamore and the ship's officers who kept Woodes Roger's own letters thought the details worth preserving in the first place. Think for a moment about how easily none of it could have survived at all. Exquemelin could have died of that early Caribbean fever before the surgeon ever bought him. He could have been killed on the Isthmus march to Panama, one indistinguishable casualty among more than 1,000. He could simply have never written anything down, content to let his years among the buccaneers fade into the same unrecorded silence that swallowed the vast majority of men who lived through this era. The same silence, in fact, that swallowed Davy Hollis, the powder monkey from 3 chapters back, whose fate after the revenge simply isn't known at all. That Exquemelin's story survived, in his own words rather than someone else's second-hand account, was never guaranteed. It happened because one sick, indentured young man was sold to a surgeon who chose kindness over profit, and because that same young man later decided the strange hard world he'd survived deserved to be written down honestly. Mistakes and violence and quiet tenderness, all included. That's the quiet, easily overlooked truth sitting beneath every dramatic pirate story ever told. Pirates didn't just live this history. Some of them, almost by accident, became the historians of their own impossible world. Men with no formal training in medicine or scholarship either one, who nonetheless left behind, in ship's logs and trial depositions and one Frenchman's carefully kept manuscript. The only real record we have of exactly what it meant to fall sick, or lose a limb, or watch a shipmate slowly waste away, on a wooden vessel with no doctor aboard and nothing standing between a man and the worst day of his life but the steady hands of whoever happened to be nearest when it came. Somewhere back at the very start of tonight's journey, a carpenter named Thomas Fenn set down a saw he'd only ever used on planking, having just taken a man's leg off in less time than it would have taken him to cut through a deal board. That single image has sat underneath everything since, every cook pressed into service as a doctor, every quartermaster counting out pieces of 8 for a lost hand, every scurvy-ravaged crew eating limes on nothing more than a folk memory nobody could explain. None of it was ever really about pirates being cruel, or careless, or indifferent to their own wounded and sick. It was about ordinary, frightened people doing the very best they could, with almost nothing, on wooden ships hundreds of miles from anyone who might have known better. Josiah Teague never became a real physician. Rhys Bevan never fully closed his fist again. Davy Hollis simply disappears from the record, the way so many of them do, his fate as unknowable to us now as it was uncertain to him then. And yet, more often than the danger alone would suggest, they lived, not because the system worked especially well, because the people running it, untrained and improvising, mostly tried anyway. You have a doctor's number saved in your phone right now, should you ever need one. You have medicine in a cabinet down the hall. That was never guaranteed, not for most of human history, and it certainly wasn't guaranteed for the man lying in a hammock 4 centuries ago, listening to a cook's footsteps and hoping they were coming his way. You're warm. You're dry. Whatever waits for you tomorrow, it almost certainly won't require a red-hot hatchet. Sleep well.